The iron key was heavier than it looked. Hattie Quinn stood at the top of a snow-buried slope on the north shore of Butternut Lake, in the pine country of northern Wisconsin, and held the key in her bare right hand. The metal was cold the way only old iron can be cold. A cold that had been waiting in a county clerk's drawer since 1989. A cold that had been hanging on a padlock since the 8th of March, 1961. She was 21 years old. She had $10 to her name and a canvas tool roll over her shoulder. She had been thrown out of the only home she had ever known 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday evening in January, in a quiet conversation at a kitchen table that had ended without raised voices and without tears, the way certain kinds of bad news end in certain kinds of households in the upper Midwest. The ice house stood in front of her exactly as the photograph on the county surplus page had shown it. Long, low, 80 feet of weathered cedar siding gone the color of wet driftwood. A steep metal roof rusted at the seams. 2 tall oak loading doors at the lakeside end chained shut with a heavy padlock. A smaller entry door at the road end. A loading ramp descending toward the frozen lake in a straight, patient line, its planking visible under the February snow. The building had not been opened in 63 years. Hattie raised the key. She lowered it. She raised it again. A raven called somewhere back in the white pines. The sound was the only sound. There was no wind. There were no engines. There was no human voice within half a mile of where she stood. The frozen lake stretched out below her flat and white under a gray afternoon sky, and somewhere out on that ice, 63 winters ago, her grandfather Otis Quinn had walked the surface with a handsaw and cut the last commercial blocks of ice ever harvested in Vilas County. She had been 5 years old when he died. She had been 4 when he taught her how to read the color of lake ice. Clear blue-black is strong, white is weak, gray is rotten and will not hold. She put the key into the padlock. The lock had been frozen shut for 6 decades and it did not turn easily. She worked it for nearly 2 minutes, breathing slowly through her nose, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. Her grandfather had told her once when she was 4, and standing on a frozen lake with her small mittened hand on the wooden handle of a saw. She was too small to pull that a person who works on ice does not hurry. Hurry, he had said in his slow Scandinavian voice, is how a man falls through. A man works the surface the way the surface allows. The ice has its own time. Learn to wait inside it. She had not understood him then. She understood him now. The lock turned. The chain rattled and fell away from the iron loops where it had hung since the afternoon her grandfather had walked away. She slid the tall oak doors apart on their iron track, and the doors opened with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the building itself. And Hattie Quinn, 21 years old, with $10 to her name and her grandfather's tools on her shoulder, walked into the cold, dark interior of the Butternut Lake Ice House for the first time in her life. What she found inside would change everything. But before that, before the chest, before the silver, before the letter sealed in pine pitch and signed by a 33-year-old man who had cried on the day he locked these doors. For the last time, there was a long road to this moment. There was a small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River. There was a librarian who took in a 7-year-old girl without hesitation. There was an old Swede with calloused hands who had said the names of 5 lakes the way some men say prayers. There was a story, and the story began long before the ice house. The story began with Otis. Otis Quinn had been born in Eagle River, Wisconsin in the autumn of 1928, the only son of a Swedish immigrant carpenter named Halvor Quinn and a Norwegian seamstress named Annika, who had come to the Northwoods in 1921 to work in the logging camps. Halvor had not become a logger. Halvor had become an iceman. He had worked as a commercial ice harvester on the lakes of Vilas County from the autumn of 1928 until the spring of 1945. And when his son Otis turned 17 in the autumn of 1945, Halvor had handed him a canvas tool roll and a pair of hand-stitched leather mittens, and had said in the slow, careful English of a man who had learned the language in his 30s that the ice had taught him everything he knew, and that he was now passing the ice to his boy. Otis had taken the tools. Otis had cut commercial ice on Butternut Lake from the winter of 1946 until the winter of 1961. 15 winters with a handsaw and a horse-drawn ice plow on the surface of a spring-fed lake, cutting blocks that weighed 300 pounds and floating them into a wooden trough that ran from the shore to the loading doors of the ice house, where the blocks were packed in sawdust and stored for summer delivery to the resorts and fish camps and small-town butcher shops of northern Wisconsin. The Butternut Lake Ice Company had been founded in 1898 by 4 Scandinavian families whose names were carved into the timber frame above the entry door: Quinn, Holloway, Vance, and Lindborg. The company had operated for 63 years without interruption. Otis was the last ice master. There had been a winter once in 1956 that Tilda would tell Hattie about 30 years later, when the lake had given 31 inches of clear blue-black ice in a single late January cold snap, the deepest ice the cooperative had ever cut. And the crew of 5 men had worked 19 straight days to bring up the harvest. Otis had come home each night after sundown, with his coat stiff with frozen lake water, and he had laid the coat on the chair beside the stove to thaw. And he had sat at the kitchen table and eaten what Greta had cooked and gone to bed. And at 4 o'clock the next morning he had risen and put the coat back on still damp, and walked the 8 miles to the lake. Tilda had been 3 years old that winter. She had only learned the story from her father much later when she was 11, and had asked him why his coat had a permanent water stain on the left shoulder. He had told her the story slowly in his careful voice, and he had told her that the coat had been the same coat he had worn every winter since 1948, and that the water stain was the lake's mark on him, and that a man who worked the lake long enough was always carrying the lake somewhere on his clothes. Tilda had remembered that. She had told it to Hattie when Hattie was 9 years old. He had married late. He had married a woman named Greta Olson in 1952, and they had had 2 daughters, Tilda born in 1953, and June born in 1962, and Greta had died of pneumonia in 1968, when June was 6. and Tilda was 15, and Otis had raised both girls alone in the same small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River that his own father Halvor had built with his own hands in 1934. Tilda had never married. Tilda had become the librarian at the Eagle River Public Library at the age of 22 and had stayed in that position for 41 years. June had married no one she would name. June had worked the front desk at a small lakeside resort 8 miles from her father's house. June had become pregnant in the spring of 2002 by a seasonal fishing guide from Duluth who had passed through Eagle River for one summer and had left before June told him anything. And June had made the same quiet decision many Northwoods women of her generation had made, which was to raise the child without the man and to let the man's absence speak for itself. The child was Hattie. Hattie Quinn had been born in the small frame house her great-grandfather Halvor had built on a cold morning in February of 2003, with her grandfather Otis sitting in the kitchen at 75 years old, drinking black coffee and waiting for the news. When the midwife came down the stairs and told him he had a granddaughter, Otis had set down his cup and walked outside without his coat and stood in the snow of the front yard for nearly 10 minutes before he came back inside and said in his slow, careful voice that the girl would be called Hattie, after his own mother who had died in Stockholm in 1919, before the family ever left for America. June had agreed. Hattie had been raised for the first 5 years of her life in a household of 3. June worked double shifts at the resort. Tilda worked full days at the library. Otis was retired, and Otis was the one who had her in the daytime, and Otis was the one who taught her things. He taught her when she was 3 how to tie her boots with the double knot a man needs for cold weather work. He taught her when she was 4 how to read the color of lake ice. He took her out onto the frozen surface of Butternut Lake on a clear morning in November of 2007, 3 months before her 5th birthday. She remembered it the way a person remembers a single still photograph from a childhood otherwise blurred. She remembered her small red mittens and the way her grandfather's left hand closed around her right hand. She remembered the way the ice under her boots looked like dark glass with snowflakes fixed inside it. She remembered her grandfather kneeling beside her in his old wool coat and pointing with one calloused finger at the surface and saying slowly in his careful voice that this ice here was clear blue-black, and clear blue-black was strong, and a man could trust clear blue-black. He pointed to a patch of ice 10 yards away that had a milky white quality to it, and he told her that the white ice was weak, that air had gotten into it, that the air was a small betrayal that did not show itself until the surface gave way. He pointed to a darker patch near the shoreline and told her that the gray ice was the worst, that gray ice was rotten. That gray ice looked solid and was not solid, and that a man who could not tell gray ice from blue-black ice did not survive on the lake. He had her say the colors back to him. Blue-black, she said. Strong, he said. White. Weak. Gray. Rotten and will not hold. He had nodded once and squeezed her mittened hand. Then he had done one more thing. He had told her to stand still and listen. She had stood still. She had listened. The wind had been very small that morning, almost nothing, and she had heard after a moment a low, slow groaning sound that seemed to come from underneath her boots. A sound like a great wooden door opening somewhere far below the surface of the lake. She had looked up at her grandfather. He had nodded once. "The ice talks," he had said. "When the cold goes deeper, the ice talks. It is the lake getting smaller. It is the water shrinking under the surface. A man who does not know what he is hearing thinks the ice is breaking. A man who knows what he is hearing knows the ice is growing. The talk is the ice making itself stronger." He had let her listen for another full minute. "You will hear this for the rest of your life," he had said, "and you will know that the ice is talking." He had told her then that she had the eye for it, that she had her great-grandfather's eye, that the eye was not given to everyone, but it was given to her, and she was to remember what she had seen and what she had heard. He died 6 months later. He died sitting in his favorite chair in the living room of the small white frame house on a Sunday afternoon in May of 2008, with a cup of black coffee on the table beside him, and the long-toothed ice saw of his last working season mounted on the wall above the fireplace, where he had hung it himself in 1961. June found him when she came home from her shift at the resort. She told Tilda over the phone, and Tilda left the library in the middle of the day for the first time in 19 years. And the two sisters sat together in the kitchen of their father's house and made the arrangements without crying the way Scandinavian sisters in certain Northwoods households do not cry until the work is done. Hattie had just turned 5 3 months before. She was told that her grandfather had gone to sleep in his chair and would not wake up. She did not understand it. She kept asking for a year when he was coming back. For the first 6 weeks after the funeral, she would not let anyone else sit in his chair. The chair was in the corner of the living room beside the fireplace. A heavy old armchair upholstered in a dark green corduroy that had gone shiny on the arms from 40 years of his hands resting on them. June had tried gently on the third evening after the burial to sit in it while reading the paper, and Hattie had walked into the room and stood very still in the doorway and looked at her, and June had stood up slowly and moved to the couch without saying anything. And after that, no one in the household had sat in the chair. It had remained empty for the rest of the year. Hattie had taken to sitting on the rug in front of it in the evenings, leaning her small back against the green corduroy, looking at the ice saw on the wall above the fireplace, and asking periodically when Grandpa was coming back. June would say that he was not coming back. Hattie would nod, and an hour later she would ask again. It took her until the autumn of her 6th year to stop asking. The second loss came 2 years later. June was 34 years old. She had been working a double shift on a Saturday in March of 2010, cleaning resort cabins through the morning and working the front desk through the afternoon. And she had come home to the small white frame house at 5 o'clock and had told 7-year-old Hattie that she had a headache and was going to lie down on the couch for a few minutes before dinner. She had laid down on the couch. She had not gotten up. The aneurysm had taken her in approximately 90 seconds. Hattie had sat in the kitchen drawing pictures of ice tools at the table where her grandfather had sat, and had not realized for nearly an hour that her mother was not breathing. She remembered afterward the specific quiet of the house in the minutes before she had walked into the living room. She remembered looking up from her drawing and feeling that the air in the house had become unfamiliar. She remembered going into the living room and saying, "Mama," and saying it again, and finally putting her small hand on her mother's shoulder and shaking her gently and understanding in the way a child sometimes understands what an adult has not yet told her, that the second person she loved had gone the way the first one had gone. She walked to the kitchen. She picked up the phone. She dialed the only number she had memorized, which was Aunt Tilda's number at the library. She told the woman who answered that her mama was on the couch and would not wake up. The woman who answered was Tilda. Tilda put down the phone. Tilda told the assistant librarian in a voice that didn't shake that she would not be coming back to the desk for the rest of the afternoon and possibly for the rest of the week, and possibly for longer. And the assistant librarian, who was 28, and had only worked at the Eagle River Public Library for 2 years, did not ask why. Tilda walked out of the library at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and drove the 7 miles to her father's house in the small green Subaru Forester she had bought used in 1998. And she found her 7-year-old niece sitting on the kitchen floor beside the telephone, with her arms wrapped around her knees and her face pressed into her sleeves. And Tilda Quinn, 57 years old, never married. No children of her own, knelt on the linoleum and gathered the child into her arms and made a decision that would shape the rest of both of their lives in less than 4 seconds. The decision was that Hattie was coming home with her. There would be no foster care. There would be no extended family in Duluth or anywhere else. There would be the small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River, the same one Halver had built in 1934, the same one Otis had raised his own daughters in, the same one June had brought Hattie home to from the hospital 7 years earlier. And Tilda would move into it, and the house would be Hattie's house, and the geography of Hattie's life would not change. This was Tilda's gift. It was not a small gift. It was the gift of a woman who had been a librarian for 35 years, and who therefore understood that a child who has lost her mother does not need to also lose her bedroom, and her school, and her street, and the kitchen where her grandfather had sat. Tilda understood that the air of a place has memory in it. She understood that the smell of pine boards and the angle of light through a particular window can hold a child together in the months when nothing else will. She moved her clothes into the spare room. She kept June's bedroom closed for 2 years, then opened it slowly. She kept the long-toothed ice saw on the wall above the fireplace where Otis had hung it in 1961. She kept the canvas tool roll on the top shelf of the hall closet where Otis had stored it for 46 years, exactly where it had always been. And in the evenings after dinner, after homework, after the dishes were washed and dried and put away, Tilda would take a small, self-published pamphlet down from the bookshelf beside her chair. A pamphlet titled The Ice Harvester's Handbook, written and printed by a Vilas County man named Eric Lindborg in 1934. and annotated in pencil by Otis Quinn across 30 years of working winters. And Tilda would read aloud from it the way other aunts in other houses read fairy tales. She read the chapter on saw maintenance. She read the chapter on reading lake ice. She read the chapter on the proper packing of blocks in sawdust insulation with a layer of white pine shavings between rows and a final layer of barn straw on top to keep the moisture from rising. Hattie sat on the rug at her aunt's feet and listened. She listened the way her mother June had once listened, and the way her Aunt Tilda had once listened, and the way every Quinn child since Halvor's arrival in 1921 had listened to the slow voice of a woman reading the language of work. There was a particular evening Hattie would remember always. She had been 9 years old. It had been the first week of November, and the first hard freeze of the season had come in overnight, and the ground in the backyard had gone white with frost. Tilda had been reading from the chapter on the cooperative's history, and she had paused in the middle of a sentence and set the pamphlet down on the side table beside her chair, and looked at Hattie for a long moment. "Your grandfather cried once in his life that I know of," Tilda had said. That was on the night he locked the loading doors of the ice house for the last time. He came home that night and he sat at the kitchen table where my mother had set out his supper, and he could not eat, and he could not speak. And my mother sat down across from him and put her hands on top of his hands and said nothing. And after a long time my father wept. He wept for an hour. He wept the way Scandinavian men weep, which is without sound, with his shoulders very still, and only the tears moving. I was 8 years old. I was sitting on the stairs in the dark above the kitchen, and I watched it through the railing, and I did not understand it. I asked my mother about it years later after my father had died. My mother told me that he had wept that night because the trade was finished, and that a man who has spent his life inside a trade does not know who he is when the trade ends. She told me he had to learn it. She told me it took him years. She told me he never quite finished. Tilda had picked up the pamphlet again. She had read for another 20 minutes. She had not mentioned the ice house for the rest of that winter. The years passed. Hattie went to Eagle River Elementary and then Eagle River Middle and then Eagle River High School. She was a quiet student. She was good with her hands. She was not interested in college. Tilda did not push her toward college because Tilda had been a librarian who believed in education, but who had also been a practical Scandinavian woman who understood that debt was debt, and that a young woman who did not know what she wanted to study should not borrow $40,000 to find out. Hattie graduated at 18. She got a job at the same lakeside resort where her mother June had worked cleaning cabins in the mornings and helping the resort's caretaker with small repairs in the afternoons. She was good at it. She had inherited her grandfather's hands. She could replace a copper pipe that had burst in a January cold snap. She could reshingle a cabin roof in October. She could read the grain of a board the way her grandfather had read the color of lake ice. She lived with Tilda the whole time. Tilda was 68 when Hattie graduated. Tilda had retired from the library 2 years earlier after 41 years at the front desk. and she had spent the first year of her retirement reorganizing the shelves of her own house and writing letters to people she had not written to in 20 years. She had been content in retirement. She had not been bored. Tilda was 70 when something began to change. It began in the autumn of 2023. Tilda had always been a strong woman, a Scandinavian woman of the old school who shoveled her own driveway and split her own kindling and changed her own furnace filter. But in October of 2023, she fell on the back porch carrying a basket of laundry and bruised her hip badly enough that she was on a cane for 3 weeks. In November, the furnace pilot light went out for the 3rd time, and Tilda could not get down on her knees to relight it, and Hattie had to do it. In December, Tilda admitted sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the snow falling outside the window that the stairs had become hard. In January of 2024, Tilda made a decision. She did not consult Hattie before she made it. She had thought about it for 3 months, and she had decided in the way Scandinavian women of her generation decide hard things by herself. And she sat Hattie down at the same kitchen table where Otis had once sat with his coffee, and she told her, "The house is going on the market at the end of the month," Tilda said. Hattie looked at her. Tilda's hands were folded on the table. They were the hands of a librarian who had spent 41 years cataloging books with a thin gold band on the ring finger of her right hand that had belonged to her own mother, Greta, and that Tilda had never taken off. "I have applied to the assisted living facility in Rhinelander," Tilda said. "They accepted me in December. I waited to tell you because I wanted to be sure. I am sure now. The realtor is coming on the 28th. Hattie said nothing. "I have arranged for you to stay with Hester Anderson," Tilda said. "You remember Hester? She was on the library board with me for 19 years. Her basement is finished. She has agreed to 3 months. That should be enough time for you to find your own place." Hattie said nothing. "I am sorry," Tilda said. "I have loved having you here. I would keep the house if I could keep the house. I cannot keep the house. I cannot take you with me to Rhinelander because Rhinelander is assisted living, and assisted living is not a place for a 21-year-old. You will have to find your own way now. I am sorry I cannot give you more time." Hattie nodded slowly. She did not cry. Her grandfather had told her once when she was 4 that a person who works on lake ice does not cry on the ice because the salt weakens the surface, and a weakened surface is how a person falls through. She had not understood it at the time. She understood it now. There is a kind of news a person receives in a life, the kind that is delivered without cruelty by people who love you, the kind that closes a chapter through no fault of anyone's. And the news is not made better by tears at the table. The news is made worse by them. The work of accepting the news is the work of keeping the surface intact. She kept the surface intact. "I understand, Aunt Tilda," she said. Tilda reached across the table. She took Hattie's hand. It was the first time she had taken her hand since the afternoon at the funeral home in March of 2010, when Hattie was 7, and Tilda had explained to her in a small carpeted room with a box of tissues on the side table that her mother was not coming back. "You have your grandfather's hands," Tilda said. Her voice was very steady. "You have his eye. You have his patience. You will be all right. I know it does not feel that way tonight. It will feel that way again." Hattie nodded. That night, after Tilda had gone to bed, Hattie sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She looked at the long-toothed ice saw mounted on the wall above the fireplace. She looked at the door of the hall closet where the canvas tool roll had sat on the top shelf for 63 years. She thought about her grandfather, Otis Quinn, and about his 5 lakes and about the ice house where his blocks had been stored. She got up after a while and walked through the rooms of the house slowly, the way a person walks through a place they are about to leave. The kitchen with the linoleum floor that had been laid in 1962 and was the same linoleum she had played on as a small child. The living room with her grandfather's chair in the corner, still in the same place it had been when he died. The hall closet with the canvas tool roll on the top shelf. Her own bedroom, the same bedroom her mother June had slept in as a child, with the window that looked out onto the side yard and the white pines along the property line. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom for a long time, looking at the bed, looking at the small dresser her mother had used at the same age, looking at the framed black and white photograph of her grandfather Otis on the dresser, taken in 1958, standing on the surface of Butternut Lake with one hand on the wooden crossbar of an ice saw. She did not cry in the bedroom either. She turned out the light. She went to bed. She did not yet know what she would do, but the seed had been planted. She moved into Hester Anderson's basement on the first day of February. Hester was 72. She was a retired 6th grade teacher. Her husband had died in 2017 of a heart attack while shoveling snow off the back deck, and she had lived alone in the small 2-story house on the south side of Eagle River for 7 years. The basement was finished. There was a small bathroom. There was a window that looked out at a snow-covered backyard with a bird feeder on a wooden pole and a battered metal bird bath that Hester filled with seed in the wintertime, because the chickadees and the nuthatches needed the calories. Hester was kind. She did not pry. She fed Hattie dinner 3 nights a week and left the other 4 nights to Hattie's own arrangements. She told her on the first evening that the basement had been her son's bedroom from 1982 until he had left for college in 1996, and that she had never finished cleaning out his old hockey trophies, and that Hattie was welcome to move them to the closet if she found them depressing. Hattie did not find them depressing. She found them in some way she could not name comforting. The first morning Hattie woke up in Hester's basement, she lay for a long time looking at the ceiling. The ceiling was popcorn texture, sprayed in the early 80s, gone slightly yellow at the seams. The light through the small window was gray. She could hear through the floor above her the soft shuffle of Hester moving around in the kitchen. The radiator in the corner ticked once, twice, 3 times. She had slept poorly. She had dreamed of her grandfather's chair in the small white frame house, and she had dreamed that the chair was empty in a different way than usual, the way a chair is empty when its house is gone. She had woken with that knowledge sitting on her chest. She sat up slowly. She put her feet on the cold concrete floor. She did the small things a person does on the first morning in a place that is not their place. She made the bed. She put the few clothes she had brought in the dresser drawer. She set the canvas tool roll on the top of the dresser where she could see it from the bed. She stood for a moment looking at the canvas roll, at the worn, waxed cotton and the leather ties Otis's hands had tied 1,000 times. Then she went upstairs to drink the coffee Hester had set out for her. She took her cabin cleaning job back at the resort, although she would have to drive Hester's car to get there now. And Hester let her drive the car because Hester had stopped driving at night, and she did not need it before 3 in the afternoon. She had $940 in her savings account. She had her grandfather's canvas tool roll. She had no plan. For 2 weeks she had no plan. For 2 weeks she went to work and came home to Hester's basement and ate dinner and lay on the spare bed in the small finished room and looked at the ceiling and felt for the first time in her life the specific weight of not having a place that was hers. It was during the 3rd week of February that she began looking at the Vilas County surplus property page. She did not go looking for a building. She went looking for the feeling of looking. She had been sitting on her bed, with her laptop open on her knees, drinking a cup of black coffee Hester had brought her from upstairs, and she had typed Vilas County into the search bar without quite knowing why. The county surplus page came up. She clicked on it. She scrolled. There were 6 properties listed. A 1962 Chevrolet pickup truck with a seized engine, $3,000. A municipal salt shed in the town of Phelps, $8,000. A parcel of pine forest on the western shore of Catfish Lake, $12,000. A commercial ice house on the north shore of Butternut Lake, $10. She stopped scrolling. She read the listing twice. A single commercial building of timber frame construction, sawdust-insulated double walls, approximately 2,400 square feet on a single story on a 1.8-acre lakefront parcel on the north shore of Butternut Lake, 8 miles south of Eagle River. The building had been constructed in 1898 by a commercial ice harvesting cooperative called the Butternut Lake Ice Company. It had operated continuously from 1898 until 1961, when the last commercial ice harvest in Vilas County had taken place. It had stood empty since. The county had taken possession in 1989 for unpaid taxes. The asking price was $10. The photograph showed a long, low building of weathered cedar siding, dark gray-brown, with age set among white pines, on a gentle slope above a frozen lake. She knew the lake. Butternut Lake was the 3rd lake her grandfather had named for her, on the morning he had taught her to read ice. Catfish, cranberry, butternut, long, anvil. She closed her laptop. She set it on the bed beside her. She walked upstairs to Hester's kitchen. Hester was at the counter making a list for the grocery store. Hattie asked her if she could borrow the car the next morning. Hester looked at her. "I need to go to the county clerk's office," Hattie said. Hester nodded slowly. What for, dear? To buy something? Hester looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said. She drove the 7 miles to the Vilas County Clerk's office in Eagle River the next morning in Hester's old Buick. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, a brick building constructed in 1923, with a green tin roof and a flagpole in the front lawn. She climbed the wide stone steps, and the inside of the building smelled the way old courthouses in the upper Midwest smell, like floor wax and steam radiators and the faint chemical ghost of carbon paper records that have been kept in metal filing cabinets for 90 years. The clerk was a man in his late 60s. He had white hair and a flannel shirt and steel-rimmed glasses that he wore on a thin black cord around his neck. He was sitting at a wooden desk behind a low counter writing something in pencil on a yellow legal pad. He looked up when Hattie came in. He took off the glasses. "Help you, miss, I'd like to look at the surplus property listing for the ice house on Butternut Lake." He did not move for a long second. He set down the pencil. He put the glasses back on. "What's your name, Miss Hattie Quinn?" He looked at her for a long time. He did not speak. He stood up slowly the way a man in his late 60s stands up after sitting at a desk for an hour. He walked around the counter. He came to a stop about 4 feet from her. He studied her face the way a man studies a photograph he had not expected to see. "You're Otis's granddaughter," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. The clerk took off his glasses again. He folded them carefully. He let them hang against his shirt on the cord. He extended his right hand. She took it. His grip was dry and firm and unhurried. "Harlan Webb," he said. "I've been the county clerk in this office for 31 years. Before that, I was the assistant clerk for 9 years. Before that, I was a kid in Eagle River whose father was the bookkeeper for the Butternut Lake Ice Company from 1948 until they closed the doors in 1961. My father knew your grandfather, miss. My father knew him well." Hattie did not speak. "My father told me when I was 11 years old that Otis Quinn was the finest ice master ever to work the lakes of Vilas County. He told me that on the afternoon of March 8th, 1961, my father stood beside your grandfather at the loading doors of that ice house, and your grandfather hung the padlock, and the two of them walked away together. My father told me that on the walk back to the truck, your grandfather cried. My father told me it was the only time in 19 years he had ever seen Otis Quinn shed a tear. And my father said it was because the trade was finished, and your grandfather knew it was finished, and there would be no more ice cut on Butternut Lake." He paused. He looked toward the window. The light through the green tin had a faint underwater quality. "There was a story my father told me only once," Harlan said. "In the winter of 1955, a man named Ola Bjork went through the ice on Butternut. He was on a crew of 3 with your grandfather. He had stepped onto a patch of gray ice that he should have known not to step on, and he went through to his armpits. The water was 32 degrees. A man who goes into 32-degree water has about 3 minutes before his hands stop working, and about 10 minutes before he stops being a man you can save. Your grandfather laid down flat on the ice. and he reached out and got his hands on Ola Bjork's coat collar, and he pulled him out. He did it in less than a minute. He did it without panicking and without losing his balance and without going through himself. And after he had pulled the man out and they had walked him back to the ice house and got him out of his frozen clothes and into a wool blanket beside the stove, your grandfather walked back out onto the ice, and he marked the gray patch with 3 pine boughs in a triangle, and he stood there and looked at it for nearly an hour. My father went out to him. My father asked him what he was doing. Your grandfather said he was reading the ice that had almost killed Ola Bjork, so he would not forget what that color of gray looked like. My father told me that. He told me it once. He did not tell it again. I think he understood that the story was a sacred thing and you do not tell sacred things often. Hattie's throat closed. She did not let it stay closed. She breathed in slowly through her nose, and she let the breath out and she nodded once. "Yes, sir," she said. Harlan Webb walked back behind his counter. He bent down. He opened a low drawer that creaked on its hinges. He reached inside and brought out a small wooden box, the kind a man's pocket watch might come in, and he set it on the counter and opened it. Inside the box, on a square of faded red velvet, was an iron key on a leather thong. The key was nearly 6 inches long. The head of the key was forged in the shape of a clover leaf. The leather thong had darkened with age, but had not broken. "This is the original key to the loading door padlock of the Butternut Lake Ice House," Harlan said. "Your grandfather hung it on the lock on the afternoon of March 8th, 1961. The county took possession of the building in 1989 for back taxes, and the assistant clerk at the time, a woman named Clara Bjorling, brought the key here and put it in this box and put the box in this drawer. It has been in this office for 35 years. It was supposed to go on the auction block twice. Twice it was pulled from the auction. The county supervisor at the time, who was the son of one of the founding cooperative members, did not want the building sold to an out-of-county buyer. He kept pulling it. He died last year. The new supervisor put it on the surplus page in November. You're the first person who has come in to ask about it." He closed the box. He pushed it across the counter toward her. $10, Miss Quinn." She reached into the front pocket of her work pants. She drew out the folded $10 bill that she had separated from her savings the night before. She set it on the counter. Harlan Webb did not pick it up immediately. He looked at her. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said. "He was a hard man, but he was a good man. He was the last of his trade. The trade does not come back, miss. Your grandfather knew that on the day he locked the doors. The trade is finished. But the building is still standing. You are buying a building that has been standing for 126 years. You are buying it for $10. I want you to understand what you are buying." "I understand," Hattie said. "I do not think you do. Not yet. But I think you will." He picked up the $10 bill. He stamped a deed in 3 places with a heavy iron stamp that hung from a swivel arm on the side of his desk. He pushed the deed across the counter. He pushed the wooden box across the counter. "Welcome home, Miss Quinn." She drove out to Butternut Lake that afternoon. The road to the ice house was an unplowed seasonal lane that had not been graded since the previous November, and she parked Hester's Buick at the plowed turnaround near the county road and walked the last half-mile through knee-deep snow in her work boots, with the canvas tool roll over her shoulder and the iron key in the front pocket of her coat. The walk took her almost 40 minutes. The pines along the lane were thick with new snow. A pair of crows watched her from a high branch and did not call. The lane curved gently to the southwest, following the contour of the slope down toward the lake, and at the end of the lane, in a clearing of about an acre, the ice house waited. She walked to the doors. She stood in front of them for a long time. The lake spread out below her under the gray February sky, flat and white. The surface marked here and there by the thin tracks of ice. Fishermen who had walked out earlier in the week. The white pines around the ice house stood very still. There was no wind. There was no sound. The air had the deep mineral cold of a lake country afternoon in the third week of February, the kind of cold that does not bite at the skin but sits behind the cheekbones and reminds a person that the surface of the world is older than they are. She drew the iron key from her coat pocket. She put it in the padlock. She worked it for nearly 2 minutes, breathing slowly, her breath clouding in the cold air. The lock had not turned in 63 years. The internal pins had rusted slightly, and the springs had stiffened, and the key did not want to move. She did not force it. She listened. She turned it with the patience of a person who had been taught at the age of 4 that a person who works on ice does not hurry. The lock turned. The chain rattled and fell. She slid the tall doors apart on their iron track. The interior of the ice house opened in front of her in a single long perspective. 80 feet of cold, dark space, 30 feet of width, 15 feet from the timber floor to the peak of the open rafters. The walls were the sawdust-insulated double walls her grandfather had described to her once. When she was 5, an outer wall of cedar siding, then a 12-inch cavity packed with mill sawdust, then an inner wall of tight-fitted pine planking. The floor was heavy timber planking laid over a drainage bed of gravel and sand, with narrow drainage channels cut into the planks at regular intervals to carry meltwater toward a drain at the lakeside end. The ceiling was open to the rafters' massive hand-hewn pine beams, the bark still on their undersides, spanning the full 30-foot width. The cold room was empty. The last blocks of ice had melted away 63 years ago, but the room was not warm. The sawdust insulation in the double walls still worked. The temperature inside the cold room, even in February with the doors open, was noticeably colder than the air outside. A deep, still mineral cold that had nothing to do with the winter weather, and everything to do with the building's original engineering. She felt it on her face. She felt it on the backs of her hands. She felt it in the air she drew into her lungs. She walked the length of the cold room. Her boots made small sounds on the timber planking. The light from the open loading doors fell in a long, pale rectangle across the floor and faded into the dark interior. She could see her breath. She walked all the way to the far end. She stopped. She turned and looked back at the rectangle of daylight at the loading doors. She had walked 80 feet into a building no one had walked into in 63 years. She turned back to face the north wall. She ran her hand along the inner pine planking. The wood was cold under her bare palm. The planks were tight-fitted tongue and groove, dark with 63 years of cold room humidity. She walked slowly along the wall, letting her hand trail across the boards, listening to the sound of her own footsteps on the timber floor. She stopped. About 4 feet above the floor near the back of the cold room, there was a section of 3 planks, whose grain ran at a slightly different angle than the planks on either side. It was almost nothing. The cut ends had been sanded smooth and fitted flush. The color of the wood matched. The thickness matched. A person walking past these 3 boards would not have noticed them in 100 years. But the grain was different. The grain ran on a long, slow diagonal across the 3 boards, where the surrounding wall ran almost true vertical. It was the kind of difference that almost no one would notice. A carpenter would notice. A person who had grown up watching a grandfather read the grain of lake ice for thickness, clear blue-black, for strong white, for weak gray, for rotten, would notice. Hattie Quinn knelt slowly in front of the 3 short planks. She set the canvas tool roll on the floor beside her. She ran her fingertips along the edges of the boards. They were not nailed. They were held in place by friction and by a thin wooden lip along the top edge. She pressed upward gently on the lip with the pads of her fingers, and the 3 planks shifted, and they came forward toward her as a single hinged panel, hinged at the bottom by a strip of leather that had stiffened with age, but had not broken. The panel opened. Behind it, in the 12-inch cavity between the inner pine wall and the outer cedar siding, the sawdust insulation had been carefully cleared away in a rectangular space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Inside the rectangular space, sitting on a folded square of waxed canvas, was a small wooden chest. It was hand-built. It was pine. It had a brass hasp and a small brass padlock. Hattie Quinn knelt very still in the cold, dark interior of the Butternut Lake Ice House, with the chest her grandfather Otis had hidden in the wall in March of 1961, sitting 2 feet from her face, and she did not yet know what the chest contained. And she did not yet know that what it contained would change the course of her entire life. She knew only that she had found it, that the lessons her grandfather had taught her on a frozen lake when she was 4 years old had led her hand to the place where the grain of the wood ran differently, and that the wall of an old ice house on the shore of a spring-fed lake in the pine country of northern Wisconsin had kept its secret for 63 years and was now ready in its own time to give it up to her. She reached into the cavity. She lifted the chest. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it out of the cold room into the gray February daylight and set it down on the snow-dusted planking of the loading ramp. She sat down beside it. The frozen lake stretched out below her. A raven called somewhere back in the white pines. Her breath made small clouds in the still, cold air. She looked at the small brass padlock. She opened the canvas tool roll her grandfather had left her, and she found the smallest hand pick. And she set the point of the pick against the padlock. Whatever was inside, she thought, had been waiting for her. She had been waiting for it too. She just had not known it. The brass padlock was small enough that she could have closed her hand around it. Hattie set the point of the smallest handpick against the keyway and worked it slowly. The pick was one of 7 tools laid out in the canvas roll her grandfather had carried for 30 years. It was a hand-forged piece of tempered steel about the length of a pencil, with a wooden grip wrapped in waxed cord, and her grandfather had used it for prying frost, stuck saw teeth out of partially cut blocks. He had not made it for picking locks. He had not made any of his tools for picking locks. But the pick was thin, and the lock was old, and Hattie had patient hands. She worked it for nearly 12 minutes. The cold sat in her shoulders. Her breath made small clouds. The light on the frozen lake below had begun to shift from gray to the particular pale blue that lake country afternoons in February turn when the sun is going down behind a cloud bank somewhere out beyond 3 lakes. She did not notice the light. She noticed only the small movements of her hand, and the small resistance of the lock, and the slow accumulation of her grandfather's teaching in her fingertips. The lock gave. It was a soft sound, almost nothing. A small metallic click. The hasp lifted free of the staple. She drew the lock out of the loop and set it carefully on the planking beside her, and she opened the lid of the chest. The interior of the chest had been lined with a folded square of waxed canvas, the same heavy waxed canvas her grandfather had used to wrap his saws when he stored them for the off-season. She lifted the canvas. She set it aside. There were 3 objects inside: a leather-bound book, small, thick, hand-stitched along the spine, a heavy canvas pouch tied at the throat with waxed cord, and the weight of the pouch was unmistakable. It was the weight of metal, not iron. Iron weighed differently. This was the dense particular weight of silver coin. A folded letter on heavy cream paper, sealed with a small dark blob of pine pitch. She picked up the book first. The leather binding was dark with age. She opened the cover. The flyleaf had been written in careful, slanting handwriting in pencil. And the pencil had not faded because the cold, dry interior of the icehouse wall had preserved the graphite. The way the cold, dry interior of certain Egyptian tombs had preserved papyrus. The flyleaf read, Butternut Lake Ice Company, Harvest Log, Volume 1, begun the 8th of January, 1898, to be kept by the ice master of the season. Hattie turned the page. The first entry was dated January 11th, 1898. The handwriting was different from the flyleaf. It was smaller, blockier, more careful, in the way an immigrant might be careful with a new language. The entry read, This day, 8 inches clear ice, cut 62 blocks, crew of 3. Halvor, Quinn, Lars, Holloway, Sven Vance, air 22 below, water 33 above, first harvest. May the lake bless the work. Hattie's hand stopped on the page. Halvor Quinn, her great-grandfather, the Swedish carpenter who had come to Eagle River in 1921, the man who had handed her grandfather a canvas tool roll in 1945 and told him the ice was now his. Except the entry was dated 1898. She did the arithmetic without thinking. Halvor would have been a young man in 1898, not the man who had come to America in 1921. A different Halvor. She turned back to the front cover of the book and read the date again. 1898. She turned forward several pages, scanning the entries. The handwriting changed twice in the first 10 years. The first ice master had signed his name at the bottom of his last entry. Halvor Quinn Ice Master, retired this day. March 19th, 1907. The second ice master had taken over and signed his first entry. Eric Lindborg Ice Master, December 14th, 1907. The Lindborg name was familiar. Eric Lindborg had written the small, self-published handbook her Aunt Tilda had read aloud to her on winter evenings. She turned forward through the pages. The handwriting changed again in 1928. The third ice master had signed his name. Halvor Quinn, the second ice master, November 9th, 1928. Her great-grandfather, the one she knew about. He had taken over from Eric Lindborg in 1928, the year her grandfather Otis had been born. She turned forward through the years. 1934, 1938, 1941. The Halvor Quinn the second handwriting was steady and patient through every winter. The entries described the harvests, the crews, the weights of blocks, the temperatures of air and water, the names of the customers who took the ice in the summer. She paused at an entry from January 12, 1934. The handwriting had recorded a delivery of 40 blocks to the St. Mary's Hospital in Rhinelander. In the margin, in a slightly looser hand, Halvor Quinn II had written, "My son Otis turns 6 tomorrow. He came to the lake with me this morning to watch the cut. He stood for 2 hours without complaint. He is a quiet boy. He watches the way a man watches." Hattie read the margin twice. She turned the page. In 1945, the handwriting changed for the last time. Otis Quinn, Ice Master, December 22nd, 1945. 5. Hattie's throat was tight. She turned forward through her grandfather's 15 years of entries. She read his handwriting with the slow attention of a person who is reading the voice of a man who has been dead for 16 years. Her grandfather had written every entry the same way: the date, the thickness of the ice, the number of blocks, the crew, the temperatures, the condition of the soles, the names of the customers. She read the entries for the winter of 1956, the winter when her Aunt Tilda would have been 3 years old. She read the entries for the winter of 1953, the winter when her Aunt Tilda was born. The winter of 1953 had been a hard one. 26 inches of clear blue-black ice on Butternut Lake by the second week of February. Otis had recorded a single line at the bottom of the entry for February 9th, 1953. A daughter, Tilda, born this morning. Greta is well. The lake gave us strong ice. Hattie put her hand to her mouth. She did not weep. She had not wept since the afternoon of her mother's funeral, and she did not weep now. But she sat with her hand pressed against her mouth for a long moment on the loading ramp of the ice house. her grandfather had locked the doors of in 1961, and she let the weight of his recorded life settle into her. She turned forward to the entry for January 19th, 1955. The handwriting was tighter than usual. Otis had recorded a harvest of 48 blocks in standard form, and then in the bottom margin he had written 4 sentences in a hand that was clearly the same, but was held by a different kind of pressure. Ola Bjork went through today. East End. Gray patch I had marked, but he forgot. Pulled him out. The lake almost took a man. Hattie read it twice. Harlan Webb's father had told the story exactly as her grandfather had recorded it. The pine boughs in a triangle. The reading of the ice afterward. Her grandfather had written nothing about the pine boughs. He had not written about himself reading the gray patch for an hour. He had simply written that the lake had almost taken a man, and he had moved on to the next day's entry, which was January 20th, and recorded 53 blocks of clear blue-black on a calm, cold morning. She turned to the last entry. It was dated March 8th, 1961. The handwriting was steadier than she had expected. A man writing his last harvest entry might have allowed himself an unsteady hand. Otis had not. The hand was the same as it had been in 1953. Slow, careful Scandinavian. The entry read, "Final harvest, 14 inches clear blue-black, 342 blocks cut, crew of 4. Otis, Quinn Robert Holloway, Thomas Vance, Henrik Lindborg, air 12 above, water 33 above. This is the last commercial harvest on Butternut Lake. The resorts have all gone to electric refrigeration. I am locking the doors tonight. Otis Quinn, Ice Master." Hattie closed the book. Her hands were very steady. She set the book on the canvas beside the chest and reached for the canvas pouch. The cord at the throat had been waxed 63 years ago, and the wax had not failed. She worked the knot loose with her fingers. The cord came free. She tipped the mouth of the pouch toward her open palm. Silver coins fell into her hand. She caught them with both palms cupped together. They were heavier than she had expected. The coins were dollar-sized, dense, dark with age, but unmistakable in their weight. Morgan dollars and peace dollars. She turned them over slowly in her hands. She did not yet count them. She put them back in the pouch and tied the cord again and set the pouch on the canvas beside the book. She picked up the letter. The pine pitch seal was the size of a thumbnail. She broke it carefully with the edge of her fingernail. The seal cracked away in 2 pieces. The paper inside was heavy cream stationery, folded in thirds, and the folds had not weakened. She opened it. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She read the letter slowly, sitting on the snow-dusted loading ramp, with the sun going down behind the cloud bank over 3 lakes and the temperature falling, and the cold beginning to find its way through the wool of her coat. To whoever finds this chest, my name is Otis Quinn. I have been the ice master of the Butternut Lake Ice Company since the spring of 1946. I am writing this letter on the night of the 8th of March, 1961. Tomorrow morning I will lock the loading doors of this ice house for the last time and walk away. I am 33 years old. The trade is finished. The resorts have gone to electric refrigeration. The fish camps buy bagged ice from the filling station in Eagle River. The butcher shops in Rhinelander and Woodruff have their own cold rooms now. There is no further need for a man who cuts lake ice with a handsaw and stores it in sawdust insulation. I have worked this ice house for 15 winters. My father, Halvor Quinn II, worked it for 17 winters before me. Before my father, the founding members of the cooperative men named Halvor Quinn I and Lars Holloway and Sven Vance and Anders Lindborg worked it from 1898 until my father took over in 1928. The cooperative has operated continuously for 63 years. I am the last ice master. I am hiding this harvest log and this silver and this letter in the double wall of the cold room because I cannot bring myself to burn the log or to deposit the silver in a bank. My father did not trust banks. He had seen too many of them fail in the years between 1929 and 1933. I do not trust them either. The log is the only complete record of 63 years of ice harvesting on Butternut Lake. Every harvest, every crew, every block, every customer. If the log is lost, the record is lost. I'm leaving it in the wall because the wall is the safest place I know. The sawdust insulation keeps the cavity dry. The double wall keeps the temperature stable. A thing sealed in the wall of an ice house will last longer than a thing stored in any bank vault or any county archive. The silver is what the cooperative's 4 founding families, Quinn and Holloway and Vance and Lindborg, have contributed to a private fund across 63 years. Small amounts from each season's profits. The fund was meant to cover emergency repairs to the ice house. No emergency ever came. The fund simply grew. I am leaving it for whoever finds this chest. Use it for the building if the building still stands. Use it for yourself if the building has fallen. I do not know who will find this chest. I am 33 years old, and I expect to live another 40 or 50 years. And I expect to die without ever knowing whether anyone opened the wall panel. That is all right. A man who has spent 15 winters on the surface of a frozen lake with a saw in his hands has learned to be patient with outcomes he cannot control. Read the ice clearly. Otis Quinn, Ice Master. March 8, 1961. Hattie folded the letter along its creases. She put it back in the chest on top of the canvas pouch beside the leather-bound book. She closed the lid. She sat on the loading ramp for a long time with the chest at her hip and the iron key in her pocket and the canvas tool roll beside her on the planking. The light on the frozen lake had gone the deeper blue of late afternoon. The raven that had called earlier called again. A wind had begun to move in the high branches of the white pines. She felt the cold in her shoulders and in her hands, and in the small of her back. She said aloud to the empty ice house and to the frozen lake and to the white pines, and to the raven in a voice that was steady the way her grandfather's last harvest entry had been steady. "Thank you, Grandpa. I will read it clearly." She drove back to Hester Anderson's house in the early dark. She carried the chest into the basement bedroom and set it on the small desk by the window and sat on the edge of the bed, and counted the silver coins by the light of a single lamp. 87. The dates ranged from 1898 to 1960. The condition of the coins was extraordinary. The cold, dry interior of the icehouse wall had protected the silver from oxidation in a way that ordinary storage could not have done. Several of the Morgan dollars were nearly uncirculated. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning, she drove to Rhinelander and walked into a coin and collectibles shop on East Davenport Street that had been in operation since 1971. The owner was a man in his middle 60s named Albin Pedersen, who had a gray beard and reading glasses on a chain, and the careful attention of a man who has spent 40 years looking at metal under good light. He spread the coins on a black velvet cloth on his counter. He examined them for almost an hour. He pulled one of the coins aside near the end. It was a Morgan dollar dated 1898, the same year the cooperative had been founded. He set it on a small jeweler's tray and held it under his loupe for a long moment. "This one," he said. "This is the one I want you to look at. 1898, the first year of your cooperative. This coin was minted in Philadelphia. It went into circulation in February of that year. By the time your great-great-grandfather Halvor put it in that pouch in some season between 1898 and 1900, it had been in 3 or 4 pockets, maybe 5. It was already a working coin. It was not new. He did not save it because it was rare. He saved it because his cooperative was working, and a cooperative that is working at the end of its first season puts something away. That is what this coin is. It is a record of a beginning. The condition is remarkable, but the value is in what it knows. I want you to keep this one. I will buy the other 86. You hold this one. Put it in a small box. Show it to your children if you have children. Tell them what I just told you." He pushed the 1898 Morgan back toward her. He told her that the silver content alone of the remaining 86 was worth approximately $2,080. He told her that the collector value, because of the condition and the unbroken date range and the documented provenance, was closer to $8,300. He told her that he would offer her $7,400 cash on the spot, no consignment. He told her that this was a fair price. He told her that he was not trying to take advantage of a young woman with a story. She accepted. He paid her in $100 bills, counted out twice on the velvet cloth. She drove back to Eagle River in Hester's Buick with $7,400 in an envelope on the passenger seat, and the 1898 Morgan dollar in the front pocket of her coat. She had never held that much money in her life. Her grandfather, Otis, had not ever held that much money in his life either. She thought about that. She thought about what the silver had been for and what her grandfather had left it for, and about the slow, patient logic of an old Swede who had not trusted banks and who had hidden a fund inside the wall of a building because the wall was a place a thing could be kept. She called the realtor that afternoon. She told the realtor she would be moving out of Hester's basement at the end of March. The realtor asked where she was going. Hattie said she had bought a property. The realtor laughed and asked her if she had inherited it. Hattie said no. She drove out to the ice house the next Saturday with a battery-powered work light. a clipboard, a tape measure, and a thermos of black coffee. And she spent the entire short February day inventorying what the building needed. She walked the cold room in slow grids. She measured the floor in 3-foot sections. She tested every plank with the heel of her boot. She noted the locations where the planking had gone soft. She climbed up onto a stepladder she had borrowed from Hester's husband's old workbench and examined the rafters with the work light, looking for water damage and rot. She walked the perimeter of the building outside in the snow, 3 full circuits examining the cedar siding for places where the boards had warped or pulled away from the studs. She made a list. The list was long. The roof was sound. The metal was rusted, but the seams had held. The walls were sound. The sawdust insulation in the double walls was still functioning, which was a small miracle of 19th century engineering. The rafters were sound. The cedar siding had warped in 3 places along the south wall, but was structurally fine. The windows, 4 small ones along the road end and 2 at the lakeside, would need reglazing. The floor was the problem. The heavy timber drainage floor had rotted in 3 places along the lower lakeside end. Decades of snowmelt had seeped under the loading doors and saturated the gravel drainage bed and the planking above it. The rotted sections had gone soft and gray, the color her grandfather had taught her to recognize. The color that meant the surface would not hold. She marked the bad sections on her clipboard. She estimated the materials. New white pine planking milled to the original dimensions from the small sawmill in Phelps that had been milling Northwood's timber since the 1940s. New gravel for the drainage bed. New copper flashing where the loading doors met the floor. She estimated labor at 0 because she would do the labor herself. She estimated the total at approximately $1,400. She had $7,400. She sat on the loading ramp at the end of the day with the cold sun going down behind the white pines and ate a turkey sandwich Hester had packed her in a paper bag, and drank coffee from the thermos and looked out at the frozen lake. She thought about how strange it was that a young woman with no plan 3 weeks ago now had a building and a deed and a fund and a list. She thought about her grandfather's letter. Use it for the building if the building still stands. Use it for yourself if the building has fallen. The building was standing. She drove back to Hester's in the early dark. The first Saturday in March, on the same morning that the last late winter ice fishermen were pulling their shanties off the lake, an old man drove a battered green Ford pickup down the seasonal lane to the ice house and parked at the turnaround. Hattie watched him get out of the truck. He was tall and slow-moving in his middle 70s, wearing a heavy wool coat the color of charcoal and a wool watch cap pulled down over his ears. He carried a folding aluminum lawn chair in one hand and a metal thermos in the other. He walked the half-mile down the unplowed lane in his work boots, without seeming to find the effort difficult. And when he reached the loading ramp where Hattie was prying up a rotted floor plank with a wrecking bar, he did not announce himself. He simply unfolded the lawn chair on a cleared section of planking, sat down in it, unscrewed the cap of the thermos and poured himself a cup of coffee. Hattie set down the wrecking bar. She straightened up. The old man did not look at her. He looked out at the frozen lake. He took a slow sip of coffee. He spoke finally without turning his head. My grandfather's name was Lars Holloway. He was one of the 4 founding members of this cooperative. He cut ice on this lake from 1898 until 1924. My father, Robert Holloway, cut ice on this lake with your grandfather from 1948 until 1961. He was on the crew of 4. On the 8th of March, 1961. His name is in the log. Hattie nodded. Wilbur Holloway, the old man said. I worked 38 years as a Finnish carpenter out of Rhinelander. Retired in 2012. My granddaughter Madeline started the Northwoods Ice Heritage Project 5 years ago, but I do not work for her. I am going to sit in this chair on Saturdays and drink coffee and watch you work. I am not going to charge you for the privilege. I am also not going to do the work for you. The work is yours. If you want to ask me a question, I will answer it. If you do not want to ask me a question, I will sit here and not say anything. Hattie nodded again. Wilbur Holloway took another sip of coffee. She picked up the wrecking bar and went back to work on the rotted plank. She did not ask him a question for nearly 2 hours. When she did, it was about the mill in Phelps and whether they could match the dimensions of the original planking. And Wilbur set down his coffee and walked the length of the cold room beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the floor and told her slowly in a voice that was very much like her grandfather Otis's voice, that the mill in Phelps had been milling Northwood's white pine for 8 decades, and that they could match anything she asked them to match, but that the man to ask was a fellow named Eldred Mickelson, who was the foreman of the 2nd shift, and who would be at the mill on Tuesdays and Thursdays after 3 o'clock, and who would take a look at her sample plank if she brought one in and treat her fairly. She thanked him. He nodded. He went back to his folding chair. She finished pulling the rotted plank and 3 more like it by the end of the afternoon. Wilbur sat in his chair the entire time. He did not stand up except to refill his coffee from the thermos and once to walk out to the edge of the loading ramp to look at a pair of trumpeter swans that had come in low over the lake. He left at 4 o'clock without ceremony. He folded the chair, screwed the cap on the thermos, said the single word Saturday and walked back up the lane to his truck. He came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. On the 3rd Saturday in the middle of March, with the cold spring sun coming through the loading doors at a low angle and a thaw beginning to soften the snow on the lane outside, Wilbur drank his coffee for an hour without speaking, and then said without preamble that his father Robert had died on a Sunday morning in February of 1989. Of complications from emphysema in a small bedroom at the back of the same Rhinelander house Wilbur had grown up in. Wilbur had been 41 years old. He had been at the bedside. His father had asked him for water and had said after Wilbur had given him the water that he was going to ask Wilbur a question, and he wanted Wilbur to answer it honestly. Wilbur had said yes. His father had said, "Did the ice house on Butternut Lake ever come down?" Wilbur had told him no. The ice house was still standing. He had driven past the lane a week before. He had not gone down the lane, but he had seen the metal roof through the trees, and the roof was still on the building. His father had nodded once. His father had said slowly in a voice that had only an hour or two left in it, that he had wondered for 30 years whether Otis Quinn's ice house would still be standing on the day he died, and that it was a comfort to know that it was. He had closed his eyes. He had died about 40 minutes later. Wilbur had not told that story to anyone for 35 years. He told it to Hattie, looking out at the lake with his coffee getting cold in his cup. Then he stopped talking. He drank his coffee. He did not say anything else for the rest of the afternoon. When he left at 4 o'clock, he said the single word Saturday, and he walked back up the lane to his truck. She got the floor work done in May and June. She drove the new white pine planks out from Phelps in the back of a borrowed pickup truck, 2 loads paid for in cash at the foreman's office. Eldred Mickelson had cut them to the original dimensions she had brought him on a sample plank, and the new wood was pale and resinous and smelled like the inside of a sawmill in a way that the old wood had stopped smelling decades ago. She laid them with her grandfather's tools, the mallet, the framing square, the heavy iron ice hook that she discovered when she turned it over in her hand was perfectly suited for prying floor planks into alignment. Wilbur watched from his chair on Saturdays and answered her questions when she asked them, and otherwise sat and drank his coffee and did not interfere. She moved out of Hester's basement on the last day of March. She moved into the ice house. She had built a small partition wall in the road-end portion of the cold room, framing it with 2x4s and insulating it with mineral wool, and finishing the interior with reclaimed pine she bought for almost nothing from a man in Land O'Lakes who was tearing down an old sugar shack. She had installed a small wood stove in the north corner with a stovepipe that ran up through the roof in a custom-cut metal flashing she had bought at the hardware store in Eagle River. She had a cot, a small propane cook stove, a composting toilet behind a partition, and a 60-gallon rainwater cistern fed from the metal roof. She did not have running water. She did not have grid electricity. She had a small gasoline generator she ran for 2 hours in the evenings to charge her laptop and her work lights and her phone, and otherwise the ice house was quiet, the way her grandfather's working life had been quiet. The first night she slept inside the building, she lay on her cot with her hands folded on her chest and listened to the building. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The metal roof creaked once, twice, 3 times, settling under the night cold, the way old metal roofs settle. A pine branch tapped against the south wall in a small wind, far out on the lake somewhere beyond the edge of her. Hearing a single loon called once and went silent. She had thought she would feel afraid. She had not felt afraid. She had felt instead a kind of recognition, as if the building had been waiting for someone to be inside it at night, and the building had not minded that the someone was her, and the building had settled the way a building settles when it understands that it is being lived in again. She slept 8 hours straight. She did not dream. She kept the cold room itself intact. She had taken the harvest log out of the wall cavity, but she had built a small climate-controlled display case out of reclaimed pine and old window glass, and she had placed the case beside the entry door with the harvest log inside it. The log was open to the entry of February 9th, 1953, the day her Aunt Tilda had been born. The lake gave us strong ice. There was a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of April, when the spring rains came in heavy off Lake Superior, and a hard storm sat over Vilas County for 3 days. Hattie had been working on the new copper flashing along the west wall of the cold room, and the rain had come through a small place she had not yet sealed in the metal roof, and a thin, steady drip had started in the middle of the cold room floor on the original 1898 planking, 3 feet from the harvest log display case. She had set a tin pail under the drip and climbed up onto the rafters with a flashlight and found the place where a roofing nail had backed out, and she had hammered the nail back in and laid a small patch of roofing tar over it. And she had come down the ladder and stood in the cold room and watched the drip slow to nothing, and felt for a moment that the building was too big for her. The list of things that could go wrong was longer than she had realized. The list of things she did not yet know how to fix was longer still. She had sat down on the loading ramp in the rain and put her face in her hands and held it there for almost 10 minutes. She had not cried. She had thought about quitting. She had thought about driving back to Eagle River and asking Hester if she could have her room back, and going back to cleaning cabins at the resort and putting the ice house on the surplus page herself for $10 and walking away. The thought had stayed for about a quarter of an hour. Then it had passed. She had stood up. She had wiped her hands on her pants. She had gone back into the building and finished the copper flashing on the west wall, and worked until 8 that evening. And she had eaten a cold sandwich at her workbench and slept again on the cot, and woken at first light and gone back to work. Wilbur had come out the following Saturday. The rain had stopped. The sun had come back. He had said nothing about the storm. He had drunk his coffee. He had watched her finish the flashing on the south wall. At the end of the afternoon before he left, he had stood for a moment beside the harvest log display case and read the entry that was open in it. And he had said quietly, without turning around, that the building had stood through worse than 3 days of rain. He had said that the building had stood through the winter of 1936, when the snow had been so heavy on the metal roof that the rafters had cracked at the south corner, and Eric Lindborg had spent 3 weeks repairing them by lantern light in February. He had said that the building had stood through the spring flood of 1951, when the lake had risen 4 feet above its usual level, and the loading ramp had been underwater for nearly a week. He had said that the building had stood through the winter of 1961, when the trade had ended, and her grandfather had locked the doors and walked away, believing that no one would ever open them again. He had said the building was older than her, and older than him, and older than her grandfather, and that buildings of that age have a habit of standing if they are looked after. He had said, "You are looking after it." He had folded his chair. He had left. It was on a clear morning in late April that the dark gray luxury sedan came down the seasonal lane. Hattie was on the loading ramp finishing the installation of the new copper flashing where the tall oak doors met the floor. She heard the engine before she saw the car. The car was a Lexus. It was clean in a way that no vehicle in Vilas County in late April was clean. The man who got out was wearing a wool overcoat and leather gloves, and the kind of expensive boots that had been bought for the appearance of country boots and had never actually been used in the country. He was about 50. He had short gray hair and a smooth-shaved face, and the small, round, wire-rimmed glasses of a man who had decided in his 30s that the glasses suggested intelligence and had been wearing them ever since. He walked down the lane in his expensive boots. He stopped about 10 feet from the loading ramp. He smiled. "Miss Quinn," he said. Hattie set down her copper snips. She stood up slowly. She did not return the smile. The man held out a business card. She did not take it. He set it down on the planking of the loading ramp. "Curtis Van Holt," he said. "North Shore Resort Holdings out of Milwaukee. We are developing a high-end resort property on the western shore of Butternut Lake. We have been looking for an architectural anchor for the property, a piece of authentic Northwoods heritage, something we can restore as a centerpiece restaurant and event space. I had my title researcher pull the parcel records last week. Your ice house is the only authentic surviving pre-1900 commercial timber frame structure on this lake." Hattie said nothing. "I would like to make you an offer," Curtis Van Holt said. $35,000 cash closing in 2 weeks. We would relocate the structure to our property on the western shore, disassembled and reassembled by our preservation contractor, who is one of the best in the upper Midwest. The building would be preserved. You would be paid roughly 3,500 times what you paid for the property. I think it is a fair offer. I think it is a generous offer. I think it is the kind of offer a young woman in your position would be wise to accept." Hattie looked at him. She looked at the business card on the planking. She looked back at him. "The building is not for sale," she said. Curtis Van Holt's smile shifted slightly. The shape did not change, but the warmth went out of it. He nodded once slowly, as if she had said something he had been expecting her to say. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I understand the sentimental dimension. Your grandfather, the harvest log. I have read the local history pamphlet. Your aunt's library, distributed in 2002. I am not insensitive to what this place means to you. But I want you to consider something carefully. You are a 21-year-old woman with no resources restoring a building that has been derelict for 63 years on a county surplus deed that was issued under circumstances that, when our title research is complete, may turn out to be technically irregular. We have very experienced counsel. I am offering you $35,000 now. I am offering you a clean transaction. I am offering you a way out before we are forced to pursue alternatives. The building is not for sale," Hattie said again. Curtis Van Holt looked at her for a long moment. He nodded. He turned around and walked back up the lane to his car. The Lexus reversed up the seasonal lane to the county road, turned, and drove away. Hattie stood on the loading ramp for a long time after the engine sound had faded. She picked up the business card from the planking. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not finish the copper flashing that afternoon. She drove into Eagle River and went to Hester Anderson's house and asked Hester if she could borrow the phone because she had not yet replaced the cellular service that had lapsed when her contract had ended in February. Hester gave her the phone. Hattie called the courthouse and asked for Harlan Webb. Harlan came on the line. She told him about the visit. She told him about the threat of irregular title. She told him she did not know what to do. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said in his slow, careful voice that the deed she held was clean. He had personally executed it. He had personally verified that the property had been in continuous county possession from 1989 forward. He told her not to worry about the title. He told her that men like Curtis Van Holt threaten things they cannot deliver, because the threat itself is a tool, and the tool sometimes works on people who do not know better. He told her she knew better. He told her to keep working on the floor. He told her something else. He said, "Miss, your grandfather had a foreman's letter from the founding cooperative members, a document from 1898. The cooperative's bylaws. My father told me when I was a boy that the bylaws contained a covenant about the disposition of the building. I do not know if your grandfather kept that document. I do not know where it might be. But if it exists, it might matter to you now. You should look for it." Hattie thanked him. She hung up the phone. She drove back to the ice house in the late afternoon. She sat on the loading ramp with the cold spring light fading on the lake and thought about the bylaws. She thought about the wall cavity where she had found the chest. She thought about her grandfather's careful nature, his Scandinavian thoroughness, his habit of putting important things in safe places. She thought about the floor. The floor was the problem. She had pulled the rotted planks at the lakeside end. She had laid the new white pine. The work was visible. But she had not pulled any of the other floor planks. The original floor was 80 feet long and 30 feet wide. The bad sections at the lakeside end were 12 feet by 15. The rest of the floor was the original 1898 planking sound and dry, never disturbed. A careful man might have hidden a second thing in a second place. A telephone call came 2 days later on a Friday morning while Hattie was working the new flashing. Hester drove out to the ice house in her Buick to deliver the message because Hattie had no phone of her own, and Hester had taken the call. A lawyer from Milwaukee, Hester said. He left a number. He said it was urgent. He said Mr. Van Holt's company is preparing a quiet title action against the county, and he wanted you to know it would be filed Monday morning unless you reconsidered the offer. He said you have until Sunday evening. Hester handed her a slip of paper with a phone number on it. Hattie looked at the paper. She thanked Hester. She did not call the number. She put the paper in her coat pocket beside the business card from Curtis Van Holt and went back to work on the flashing. 2 days later, on a cold gray afternoon in late April, Hattie pried up an apparently sound plank at the northwest corner of the cold room, near the old harness hooks where the cooperative had hung its working tack between seasons. The plank came up easily, too easily. The nails had been pulled out of it once before long ago and driven back in shallow. Beneath the plank, lying on the gravel drainage bed, wrapped in 3 layers of heavy oiled canvas that had been waxed at the seams to seal against moisture, was a long rectangular bundle. She lifted it. It was heavy. She unwrapped the layers of oiled canvas slowly on the cold room floor And what was inside the canvas was a complete master ice harvester's tool set, 12 tools individually wrapped in waxed cloth, a scoring chisel longer than the one in the canvas roll, a heavy spud bar with an iron head forged in the shape of an arrow, a pair of master block tongs with cherry wood grips polished by decades of use, 3 graduated ice saws, the longest of them 4 feet from the heel of the blade to the tip, a packing hook, a measuring rod marked in inches and feet with the marks burned into the hardwood with a hot iron, a leather hone for keeping the saw teeth sharp, a small hand auger, a pair of caulked deck boots sized for a man of about Hattie's height, the heavy nailed soles still showing the marks of their last work in winter, and beneath the tools at the bottom of the canvas bundle was a sealed envelope. The envelope was heavy cream paper, the same paper as the letter she had found in the chest. The wax seal on the envelope was unbroken. Across the front of the envelope in her grandfather's handwriting were 5 words: "For the next ice master." Hattie sat back on her heels in the cold room floor with the envelope in her hands, and the master tool set spread out around her on the canvas. And she looked at her grandfather's writing, and she understood in the slow, accumulating way she had come to understand things. Since opening the loading doors in February, that the chest in the wall had not been the only thing he had left. He had left a second thing, and the second thing had been left for someone he had not named but had described: the next ice master. She broke the seal. The envelope contained a single document folded in thirds on heavy parchment weight paper that had yellowed only slightly at the edges. The document was hand-lettered in black India ink in a careful, old-fashioned script. Across the top, in larger letters, were the words "Bylaws and Charter of the Butternut Lake Ice Company. Executed this 14th day of June, 1898. Hattie read the first paragraph. She read it again. She read it a third time. She held the document very carefully in both hands in the cold afternoon light coming through the open loading doors, and she understood that what she had found was not a memento. It was a legal instrument, and the instrument had been waiting sealed under a floor plank for 63 years for a person who would need it. She thought of Curtis Van Holt in his expensive boots. She thought of his smile that had no warmth in it. She thought of the lawyer from Milwaukee whose number was in her pocket. She thought of her grandfather who had been 33 years old when he sealed this envelope and who had spent 15 winters on a frozen lake and who had learned to be patient with outcomes he could not control. She folded the document carefully along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She wrapped the envelope in a clean square of waxed cloth from the canvas roll. She stood up. She walked out of the cold room into the gray afternoon with the document in her hand, and she stood on the loading ramp and looked at the lake. The ice on Butternut Lake had begun to go. The first soft places had appeared near the western shore 3 days ago. The center of the lake was still strong, but the surface was no longer the surface of winter. It was the surface of late spring. The blue-black had gone milky in places. The white edges had widened. The lake was changing. She thought about what her grandfather had taught her. White is weak. Gray is rotten. Blue-black is strong. She looked at the document in her hand. She did not yet know exactly what it said in its full legal weight, but she knew in the way her grandfather had known things on the morning he had walked away from these doors, that the cooperative his great-grandfather had helped found had not built this ice house to be moved. She drove into Rhinelander the next morning with the document folded in a flat manila envelope on the passenger seat of Hester Anderson's old Buick. Wilbur Holloway's grandson was a lawyer. Hattie had not known this until Wilbur had told her the previous Saturday in the slow, indirect way the old man told her things he thought she would need. The grandson's name was Soren Holloway. He had practiced in Rhinelander for 19 years. He had a small office on Brown Street above a hardware store, and he handled wills and estates and property matters for old Northwood's families. And Wilbur had said, sitting in his folding chair on the loading ramp, with his coffee, that if she ever needed someone to look at a piece of paper for her, his grandson would look at it without charging her, because his grandson had grown up knowing whose granddaughter she was. She climbed the wooden stairs to the second floor of the building on Brown Street. The office was a single room with 2 windows facing the street. There was a heavy oak desk and a wooden filing cabinet, and a bookcase full of legal volumes that had the patient look of books that had been bought used and read carefully. Soren Holloway was a tall, thin man in his middle 40s with the same slow, careful manner as his grandfather, and a wedding band on his left hand that looked like it had been worn for a long time. He stood up when she came in. He did not smile. He did not need to smile. He extended his hand. "Miss Quinn," he said. She shook his hand. He gestured to a wooden chair across the desk from his own. "I spoke to my grandfather last night," he said. "He told me you might be coming in." Hattie sat down. She set the manila envelope on his desk. She told him about Curtis Van Holt. She told him about the Lexus and the boots and the smile. She told him about the offer and the threat of irregular title and the lawyer from Milwaukee. She told him that she had called Harlan Webb and Harlan had told her about the bylaws, and that she had then found the canvas bundle under the floor plank, and she opened the manila envelope and slid the document across the desk to him. Soren Holloway picked up the document with the kind of care a man uses to pick up an old photograph. He read it for almost 20 minutes. He did not speak while he read. He turned the pages once, then turned them back. He took a yellow legal pad from a drawer of the desk and wrote slow notes on it in a small, careful hand. Hattie watched him without interrupting. Outside the window of the office on Brown Street, a county snowplow moved slowly past, scraping the last grit of winter sand off the pavement. When he had finished reading, Soren Holloway set the document on the desk between them. He took off his reading glasses. "Miss Quinn," he said, "this is an extraordinary document." Hattie nodded. The bylaws of the Butternut Lake Ice Company were executed in the summer of 1898 by the 4 founding members and were filed with the Vilas County Registrar of Deeds in the same year. The original filed copy is presumed lost. The county registrar's office burned in 1934, and a great many older property records were destroyed. What you have in your possession is a duplicate original hand-lettered at the same time as the filed copy retained by the cooperative's first ice master, a man named Halvor Quinn I, your great-great-grandfather. Hattie did not speak. The document, Soren said, contains a covenant in the 7th paragraph. The covenant restricts the disposition of the ice house and its parcel. Specifically, he looked down at the document. The ice house and the parcel upon which it stands shall not be sold, transferred, relocated, or materially altered without the unanimous written consent of the surviving lineal descendants of the 4 founding families, Quinn, Holloway, Vance, and Lindborg. The covenant runs with the land. It is binding on all subsequent owners, including, in this case, the county of Vilas, and any party who acquires the property from the county. Hattie was very still. Mr. Van Holt's title research, Soren said, would not have found this document because the original filed copy in the county registrar was destroyed in 1934. His title researcher would have seen a clean chain of title from 1989 forward. He would have concluded that the property was unencumbered. He was wrong. The covenant exists. You hold the only surviving evidence that it exists. The covenant is enforceable. Hattie said slowly, "What does it mean?" "It means," Soren said, "that even if Mr. Van Holt had succeeded in challenging your county deed and acquiring the property himself, he could not have moved the ice house. He could not have sold it. He could not have materially altered it without the written consent of the surviving descendants of the 4 founding families. As far as I am aware, the surviving descendants are yourself, my grandfather and my father and myself, the surviving Vance descendants who live in Eau Claire, and the Lindborg descendants who I will need to research. None of those families would consent to relocation. I am quite certain of that." He paused. "It also means," he said, "that what you found under the floor plank is the only thing that can stop him. Without this document, his attorneys could have made your life very difficult. With it, he has nothing." Hattie looked at the document on the desk. She thought of her grandfather Otis sealing the envelope on the night of March 8th, 1961. She thought of him wrapping the master tool set in oiled canvas and waxing the seams against moisture and hammering the floor plank back down with shallow nails so the next ice master could find it. She thought of him not knowing who would find it. She thought of him being patient with outcomes he could not control. "I will draft a response to Mr. Van Holt's company," Soren said. "I will copy the relevant section of the bylaws. I will indicate that any further action against your title will be met with a counterclaim under the covenant. I do not believe you will hear from him again." He set the document down. He folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Quinn," he said, "may I tell you something about my family?" She nodded. "When my grandfather Wilbur was 11 years old, his father Robert took him out to the ice house on a Saturday in February of 1959. There was a winter harvest going on. My grandfather watched your grandfather Otis cut blocks for an hour. He watched Otis pull a saw through 14 inches of clear blue-black ice with a rhythm he never forgot. He told me about it once when I was a boy. He told me the rhythm of the saw was like a man breathing slowly, and the man and the lake were breathing together, and the thing they were breathing was the cold. He said he had never seen a man so completely at home inside a piece of work. He said it stayed with him his whole life. He went into finished carpentry partly because of what he had watched Otis Quinn do at the age of 11 on a Saturday morning on Butternut Lake. The work shaped him. Soren paused. When my grandfather drove out to that ice house this past March and sat in his folding chair on the loading ramp, he was 65 years past that Saturday morning. He had not driven down that lane since 1961. He had not let himself. He told me the night he came home from his first Saturday with you that he had been afraid for 63 years of what he might find if he ever went back. He told me that he had walked down the lane that morning expecting to find a collapsed building, and that he had instead found a young woman pulling a rotted plank out of a drainage floor with her grandfather's wrecking bar. He told me he had recognized your hands on the tool. He told me he had recognized the way you had set the bar against the wood. He had stood at the edge of the lane for a moment before you saw him watching. He said it had taken everything in him not to weep. Soren looked at her steadily. I am glad to do this work for you, he said. There will be no fee. Not now, not ever, not for any matter that touches that building. My family owes a debt to your grandfather that we have never been asked to pay. You are not asking us to pay it. We are paying it anyway. Please understand that. Hattie nodded. She did not speak. She stood up after a long moment and shook his hand, and he walked her to the door of the office, and she went back down the wooden stairs to Brown Street and drove back to the ice house in the early afternoon and did not stop the car the whole way. She did not hear from Curtis Van Holt again. The letter from Soren Holloway's office went out on a Tuesday in early May. The response from North Shore Resort Holdings came back 9 days later on a single sheet of letterhead, in a single paragraph signed by an in-house attorney. The paragraph withdrew the offer. The paragraph wished Miss Quinn well in her endeavors. The paragraph did not mention the covenant by name, but the careful avoidance of certain words made it clear that the covenant had been read and that the matter was closed. Hattie folded the letter. She put it in the climate-controlled case beside the harvest log. She drove down to Eau Claire on a Saturday in the middle of May to meet the surviving Vance descendants. Soren Holloway had given her their address. She had written a letter, first 3 pages on plain paper, explaining who she was and what she had found. And the head of the family, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher named Inga Vance, had written back and invited her to dinner. Inga lived in a small brick house on the south side of Eau Claire with her husband, and they had 4 grown children and 7 grandchildren. And on the afternoon Hattie arrived, they had 3 of the grandchildren over for the day. Inga met Hattie at the door. Inga had her grandfather Sven Vance's photograph on the mantel, taken on Butternut Lake in 1923, and she had a small wooden box on a side table that contained Sven's original union pin from the cooperative. She showed Hattie the pin. She let Hattie hold it. She said when Hattie set it back in the box that her family had not driven past the lane to the ice house since 1962. That her father had decided after the cooperative closed that the place would only be a sadness, and that the sadness had passed down to her without the place itself. Hattie told her about the discovery in the wall. She told her about the covenant. She told her that the covenant required Inga's signature, along with the Quinn signature, and the Holloway signatures, and the Lindborg signatures, on any document affecting the disposition of the building. Inga listened. She did not interrupt. When Hattie had finished, Inga said slowly that she had not known her family was on a covenant. She had not known her name was tied legally to a building 8 miles from Eagle River. She said she was glad to know it. She said she would not be signing any document moving the building. She said she would tell her 4 children and her 7 grandchildren that they were not to sign any such document either for as long as any of them lived. She said this slowly in the voice of a Wisconsin school teacher who had been firm with 6th graders for 37 years, and Hattie understood that what she was hearing was a covenant being renewed without ceremony at a kitchen table in Eau Claire on a Saturday afternoon in May. Inga had walked her out to the car at the end of the visit. She had said one more thing. She had said that her grandfather Sven had told her father on the night of March 8th, 1961, that Otis Quinn was a man who would carry the trade with him for the rest of his life and never speak of it. She had said her grandfather had been right. She had said that what Hattie had done at the ice house in the month since February was the trade speaking for the first time in 63 years, and that the trade speaking through a young woman of 21 was the most surprising thing her grandfather Sven could not possibly have predicted, and the most fitting thing he could not possibly have asked for. She had hugged Hattie once at the car door. She had said, "Drive safely," and read the ice clearly. Hattie had driven back to Eagle River that evening with the words "read the ice" clearly in her ears all 4 hours of the drive. She went back to work on the floor. She finished the last of the new white pine planking on a Saturday in the middle of June. The new wood was pale against the dark surrounding timber. But she knew from her grandfather's handbook that the new wood would darken within 2 winters to match the rest, and she was content to let time do that work. Wilbur Holloway sat in his folding chair through the entire morning of the last plank. He drank his coffee. He did not say anything until she had set the last copper nail and was kneeling on the floor with her palm flat against the new planking, feeling the tightness of the seam where the new wood met the old. Then he said slowly, "Miss." Hattie looked up. "My grandfather Lars helped lay this floor in the summer of 1898, Wilbur said. He was 26 years old. He had been in this country for 4 years. He did not yet speak good English. He laid the planks with a man named Halvor Quinn I, who had been in this country for 2 years, and who spoke worse English than my grandfather did. The 2 of them laid this floor in 3 weeks, working from a drawing one of the Lindborg boys had made on a piece of pine board with a carpenter's pencil. He took a slow sip of coffee. "You laid that last plank the same way they laid the first one," he said. "I have been watching you for 4 months. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I am sure now. You laid it the same way. Your grandfather taught you." Hattie did not speak. "You are the next ice master," Wilbur said. He looked out at the lake. My father told me on the night before he died that he hoped the building would still be standing on the day he died. It was. He hoped the building would still be standing on the day I died. It will be. I do not need to ask you to make that promise. You already made it the day you walked through those doors. I just want you to know. I see it. I want you to know. My father would have seen it. I want you to know your grandfather would have seen it. He did not say anything else for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after Wilbur had folded his chair and walked back up the lane to his truck, Hattie sat on the loading ramp with a cup of black coffee and watched the light go on the lake. The ice had been gone for 2 months. The water was the deep, cold blue it turned in early summer before the surface temperature came up. A loon called somewhere out toward the western shore. The white pines around the ice house stood very still in the windless evening. She thought about what Wilbur had said. She did not feel like an ice master. She felt like a young woman who had been thrown out of a house in January and had bought a building for $10 and had patched a floor. But she understood in the way she had come to understand things since February that being an ice master was not a feeling. It was a way of moving through work. Slow, careful, patient with outcomes a person could not control. Reading the difference between what holds and what does not. The feeling, if it came, would come later. It was not the point. The point was the work. She made one more discovery that summer. It was on a hot afternoon in late July, and she had been sitting on the loading ramp eating a sandwich, and she had picked up the harvest log to read the entry from the same date, in 1953. The cold room display case was off limits to handling, but she had taken the log out for a moment to read the entry directly the way her Aunt Tilda had once read the handbook to her on winter evenings. She read the July entry. She turned to the back of the book. The back end paper of the leather binding had a small bulge in the lower right corner that she had not noticed before. She had not been looking for it. She had only seen it because the afternoon sun was coming in at a low angle through the loading doors and was casting a shadow across the end paper that revealed the slight elevation of the leather over something underneath. She turned the book over in her hands. She felt the back end paper carefully with her fingertips. There was a piece of paper hidden beneath the leather. She took the log to her workbench inside the partition wall. She turned on the work light. She worked the leather of the end paper free along its bottom edge with the smallest blade of her grandfather's hand. Picked the one she had used in February to open the brass padlock. The leather had been glued 63 years ago, and the glue had dried, and the leather lifted away cleanly along the seam. Beneath the leather, pasted to the inside of the backboard of the binding, was a folded piece of heavy cream paper. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map. The map had been drawn in pencil with the careful precision of a man who had spent 15 winters reading the surface of a frozen lake, and who therefore knew how to render space. It showed the ice house, the loading ramp, the slope down to the water, the shoreline of Butternut Lake and the surrounding stand of white pines. A small symbol in the shape of a star had been drawn at the base of one of the pines about 40 feet north of the ice house, near the edge of the original cooperative parcel. Beside the star, in small, careful letters, her grandfather had written 2 words: hollow tree. Hattie set the map on the workbench. She stood at the bench for a long moment looking at the star, and at the two words and at the careful pencil lines that marked the position of the tree against the corner of the ice house. She walked outside into the late afternoon sun. She walked north of the ice house, counting paces. The white pine stood at the edge of the cooperative parcel, exactly where her grandfather had drawn it. It was a large tree, perhaps 3 feet across at the base, with the deep furrowed bark of an old Northwoods pine that had been growing since before the cooperative had been founded. She circled the tree slowly. The bark was sound on the south and east faces. On the north face, hidden from the ice house by the curve of the trunk, there was a long vertical crack in the bark, narrow at the top and widening near the base that opened into a hollow about 2 feet above the ground. She knelt at the base of the tree. She reached her arm into the hollow. Her fingers found something wrapped in oiled canvas. The same heavy oiled canvas her grandfather had used to wrap the master tool set under the floor. She drew the bundle out. It was longer than the tool bundle, nearly 4 feet long and narrower. She unwrapped the canvas, slowly kneeling on the pine needles at the base of the tree, with the late afternoon sun coming sideways through the white pines, and the loon calling again somewhere out on the lake. Inside the canvas was a single ice saw. The saw was 4 feet long. The blade was slightly wider than any of the saws in the canvas tool roll. The teeth were hand-cut and hand-set, with the careful asymmetric pattern her grandfather had described to her once when she was 4. The wooden crossbar handle was hardwood. The handle had been worn smooth by years of use. The grips were dark with the patina that human hands laid down on wood across decades. A small brass plate had been screwed into the handle just below the grip. The plate had been engraved with 3 lines of careful script. Otis Quinn, Personal Saw, 1946 to 1961. This was the saw he had used. This was the saw she had been too small to pull when she was 4 years old. Hattie sat at the base of the white pine for a long time, with the saw across her knees and the canvas spread under it on the pine needles. And she did not weep. She had not wept since the afternoon of her mother's funeral. She did not weep now. She only sat with her grandfather's working tool in her hands and listened to the loon on the lake and watched the late sun moving through the upper branches of the white pines, and understood that the man who had taught her to read ice when she was 4 had also, on the afternoon of March 8, 1961, taken the saw he loved most and wrapped it in oiled canvas and hidden it in a tree against the possibility that someday a person would come who could use it. That person was her. She wrapped the saw again. She carried it back to the ice house and laid it carefully on the workbench inside the partition wall. She cleaned the blade with a soft cloth and a small amount of mineral oil. She honed the teeth with the leather honed from the master tool set. She mounted the saw on the wall above her cot, where she could see it from where she slept, on a pair of iron pegs she had set into the pine paneling that afternoon. She did not yet know what she would do with it. She had an idea. She kept the idea quiet. The summer ran its course. She finished the small interior partition. She finished the rainwater cistern. She finished the windows. She caulked the cedar siding on the south wall in 3 places where the boards had warped. She drove out to Rhinelander once a month to visit Aunt Tilda at the assisted living facility and to bring her photographs of the work and to read aloud to her in the small private room with the window that looked out at a stand of birch trees from her grandfather's annotated copy of the Lindborg Handbook. Aunt Tilda was 71 years old. She walked with a cane. She was sharp. In late August, on a Saturday afternoon visit, Hattie brought her the photograph she had taken of the personal saw mounted on the pine wall above her cot. And Aunt Tilda looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then she said slowly, "Your grandfather hid that saw." Hattie nodded. Aunt Tilda looked at the photograph for a long time more. "I knew he hid something," she said. "I knew it for 50 years. He would not say what. He told me once when I was about 30 that he had left things at the ice house that he could not bring home. He said the wall of an ice house is the safest place a man can keep what he loves. He said it more than once. I never asked him what he meant. I should have asked. I did not want to make him sad." She took Hattie's hand. "You found everything." Hattie nodded. "You read the difference," Tilda said. "You read it the way he taught you. He would be proud of you, Hattie. He is proud of you. I do not believe in many things at my age, but I believe that." Hattie sat with her aunt's hand in her own for a long time, in the small private room at the assisted living facility with the late August light falling through the window across the foot of the hospital bed. She drove back to Eagle River that evening in the early dark. In the 3rd week of September, with the birches along the lakeshore beginning to go gold, and the white pines holding their dark green against the blue of the late summer sky, Hattie drove down to Rhinelander to bring Aunt Tilda out to the ice house for an afternoon. The facility had a small accessible van they would loan to family members on weekends, and Hattie had borrowed it, and she had loaded a folding wheelchair into the back, and she had driven Aunt Tilda the 11 miles out to Butternut Lake on a clear afternoon, with the temperature in the middle 60s, and the sun on the lake making the water look like hammered tin. Tilda had not been to the ice house since 1968. She had not been down the seasonal lane since 1962, the year their father had taken her at age 9 on a Sunday afternoon to show her where he had worked the year after he had locked the doors. Hattie wheeled her down the lane in the folding wheelchair. The lane was rough, but the chair held. Tilda was very quiet on the way down. She had not said much in the van either. When the ice house came into view at the end of the lane set among the white pines on the gentle slope above the lake, Tilda put her hand to her mouth and held it there. Hattie wheeled her up to the loading ramp. She helped her up the 3 wooden steps Hattie had built into the side of the ramp earlier in the summer, knowing she might need them. She helped her into the cold room. The cold room was empty. The new white pine planking on the lakeside end was visibly paler than the original 1898 timber, but it had begun over the summer to take on the first shadow of the darker color. The harvest log sat in its display case beside the entry door. The personal saw was visible on the wall above Hattie's cot, through the open partition door. The afternoon light came through the open loading doors at a long late summer angle, and fell across the floor in a rectangle of warm gold. Tilda sat in the wheelchair in the middle of the cold room. She did not speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then she said slowly that she had been in this room exactly twice in her life. Once at the age of 9 with her father. Once at the age of 15 with her mother. 2 months before her mother died on a summer afternoon when the cooperative had been closed for 7 years and the building had sat empty, and her mother had wanted to walk through it once before her health failed. Tilda said she had not thought at 15 that she would ever be in this room again. She said my father stood right where you are standing. She said he taught my sister June to read ice in this very room when June was 4. She did not have the eye for it. He told her she did not have the eye and he was kind about it. And June was not bothered. June was bothered by other things, but she was not bothered by the ice. She did not need to read it. She had her own way of moving through the world. She paused. You have his eye, Tilda said. I knew you had it the first time I watched you set a board on the kitchen table. You were 9. You were fixing a chair leg. You set the board on the table without measuring it twice. You measured once. You set the board. The board was right. I sat in the kitchen and watched you, and I thought my father. The eye does not skip generations, but it does not always come down through every line. It came down through you. Hattie sat on the loading ramp beside her aunt's chair. She did not speak. The afternoon light moved slowly through the cold room. Tilda asked after a while to be wheeled to the harvest log display case. Hattie wheeled her there. Tilda read the entry the log was open to. February 9th, 1953. The lake gave us strong ice. Tilda put her hand on the glass of the display case and let it rest there. She said my father was sitting in the kitchen the morning I was born. My mother was upstairs. My father was waiting. The midwife came down and told him I was a girl and that my mother and I were both well. He stood up. He went outside. He stood in the snow of the front yard for almost 10 minutes. My mother told me that when I was older. He came back inside, and he said in his careful voice that my name would be Tilda, after his mother who had died in Stockholm before the family came over, and that he would be returning to the lake in the morning to finish the harvest. My mother said, all right. She held me. He went back to the lake the next day. He cut blocks for 2 weeks. The lake gave him strong ice. Tilda's voice did not break. It remained the careful, slow Scandinavian voice of a librarian reading from a shelf of books no one else had thought to read. Hattie put her hand on her aunt's hand on top of the display case glass. They stayed that way for a long time. Hattie wheeled Tilda back down the lane in the late afternoon. She helped her into the van. She drove her back to Rhinelander in the early evening and helped her settle back into the small private room at the facility. And Tilda was quiet during the trip back, and Hattie did not push her to speak. Tilda fell asleep in her chair beside the window before Hattie left. Hattie stood in the doorway and watched her sleep for a long moment. and she understood the way a person understands certain things that this might have been the last time her aunt would see the ice house. She did not know it for certain. She felt it. The feeling was correct. She drove back to the ice house in the dark. The autumn passed. The first snow came in the second week of November. The second snow came 3 days after the first. By the end of November, Butternut Lake had begun to freeze along the edges. The thin, clear plate ice that her grandfather had taught her was the first stage of a true winter surface. By the first week of December, the lake was sealed shore to shore with a clear blue-black plate that had grown overnight in a hard, cold snap. And Hattie woke up in her cot in the small partitioned room at the road end of the ice house and looked out the window at the lake and understood that the time had come. She had been preparing through the autumn. She had restored her grandfather's master tool set across 3 months, working in the evenings under the gas lamp on her workbench. She had honed every saw blade. She had oiled every wooden grip. She had replaced the leather lacings on the block tongs. She had repaired the heel on the personal saw. She had walked the lakeshore in October and selected the place she would cut. She had told no one what she planned. She had not even told Wilbur Holloway, who continued to drive out every Saturday in his green Ford pickup and sit in his folding chair on the loading ramp and drink coffee, although the chair had moved indoors for the cold weather and now sat just inside the loading doors. There had been a storm at the start of December that had tested her. The temperature had dropped to 22 below zero on a Thursday night, and the wind had come off the lake hard from the northwest, and the wood stove in the partitioned room had burned through her supply of split oak in the first 6 hours of darkness, and Hattie had spent 3 hours in the middle of the night splitting more oak by lantern light in the lean-to she had built off the back of the ice house. She had come back inside at 3 in the morning with her hands so cold she could not feel the buttons on her coat. She had stood in front of the wood stove for nearly 20 minutes, slowly working her fingers back into life. She had thought in those 20 minutes about the men her grandfather had worked with, about the men who had built this building in 1898, in temperatures not very different from the temperatures she was working in now, about her great-great-grandfather Halvor I, who had laid this floor with Lars Holloway in a summer when the temperature was probably 80 degrees warmer than the night she was standing in, about what those men had carried and what they had passed forward, and what was being asked of her now. She had slept the rest of the night on a blanket on the floor in front of the stove. She had woken at first light with her hands working again. She had gone back to splitting oak. The building had held. The walls had kept the cold out the way they had been designed to keep the cold out. The wood stove had kept the small room warm enough. The storm had not broken her. The morning after the storm, with the temperature still at 12 below zero, and the wind died down to nothing, and the lake holding the dawn light in a long, pale strip from the east. She had stood on the loading ramp in her wool coat with a cup of coffee and understood that she could do this. The first month had been the test. She had passed it. She would pass the rest. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, with the air at 12 below zero Fahrenheit and the lake at a measured 33 degrees, and the ice on Butternut Lake at 14 inches of clear blue-black. Hattie Quinn put on her grandfather's caulked deck boots, which fit her and her own heavy wool coat, and her work gloves, and she carried the personal saw and the spud bar and the measuring rod down the loading ramp to the lake. Wilbur Holloway was sitting in his folding chair just inside the loading doors. He had arrived at 6 in the morning. He had not asked her what she was going to do. He had only sat in his chair in his coat with his thermos of coffee on the planking beside him and waited. She walked out onto the ice. She walked 20 paces from the shoreline and knelt and used the spud bar to score a small test hole through the surface. She measured the ice with the rod. 14 inches. Clear blue-black the way the lake had been. Clear blue-black on the morning her grandfather had taken her out when she was 4. She marked the corners of a single block. The block was 22 inches by 30 inches by 14 inches deep. The standard dimensions her grandfather had cut for 15 winters. She used the scoring chisel from the master set to score the lines along the marks. She set the personal saw at the corner of the first line. She knelt on the ice. She put both gloved hands on the wooden crossbar. She paused for a moment. She listened. The ice was talking. It was a low, slow, groaning sound. The sound her grandfather had taught her to recognize on the morning in November of 2007 when she was 4 years old. The ice was the lake getting smaller. The ice was the water shrinking under the surface. The ice was making itself stronger. She pulled. The saw teeth bit. The blade went down through the ice with the slow, patient rhythm a person learns from a man who has spent 15 winters on a frozen lake. She pulled on the upstroke. She let the weight of the saw do the work on the downstroke. She breathed through her nose. She did not hurry. She cut the 4 sides of the block in slightly under 20 minutes. The block floated free. She stood up slowly. She set the saw on the ice. She used the long block tongs to lift the block. The block was heavy 300 pounds, the same weight her grandfather's blocks had been. The tongs bit into the corners of the block the way they were designed to bite, and the block came up out of the water on its first lift, dripping, and she set it on the surface of the surrounding ice. She walked it carefully across the ice on the wooden runners she had laid out from the shore that morning, the way the cooperative's old photographs had shown the runners laid. She slid the block up the loading ramp. She slid it through the loading doors. She stopped just inside. She set the block on the timber floor of the cold room. The cold room had been empty for 63 winters. It was not empty now. A single block of clear blue-black ice from Butternut Lake sat on the timber floor, where the original 1898 floor met the new white pine planking she had laid in May. The block held the late morning light coming through the loading doors, and the light went into the ice and through it, and came out on the other side faintly blued. The drainage channels in the floor caught the small drops of meltwater coming off the block and carried them slowly the way they had been designed to carry meltwater toward the drain at the lakeside end. The building was working again. The system that had sat dormant for 63 years was working again in a small way with a single block of ice sitting on its floor. Wilbur Holloway stood up from his folding chair. He walked across the cold room to the block. He looked at it for a long time. He was crying. He did not make any sound. The tears moved slowly down his face into the gray stubble on his chin. He did not wipe them. He stood beside the block of ice with his hands in the pockets of his wool coat and let the tears run. Hattie stood across from him. She did not speak. After a while, Wilbur said in a voice that was very steady, despite the tears, that this was the first block of ice cut on Butternut Lake in 63 years. He said his father had told him on the night of March 8th, 1961, that he would not live to see another block come up that ramp. He said his father had been right. He said his father had died in 1989 and had never seen another block. He said he himself had not expected to see another block, that he had been 74 years old when she had first opened the loading doors in February, and he had thought, watching her work the floor through the spring and summer, that she might do many things with the building, but that he had not let himself think she would do this thing. He said, "Miss." She nodded. He said, "Your grandfather knew." He said your grandfather had hidden the saw in the tree because he knew. He said, "No man hides a working saw for a granddaughter who is not yet born, unless he believes somewhere in the part of him that does not speak, that she will come and that she will use it." He said, "Your grandfather believed in you for 63 years. He said, and you came." Hattie sat down on the floor of the cold room beside the block of ice. She put her gloved hand flat on the surface of the block. She felt the cold come up through the leather of the glove. She thought of her grandfather kneeling beside her on the morning in November of 2007 and pointing at the surface of this same lake and saying slowly that clear blue-black was strong. She thought of him taking her small mittened hand in his calloused hand and saying, "You have the eye for it." She had the eye for it. She had had it since she was 4. She kept her hand on the block for a long time. Wilbur sat back down in his folding chair. He did not say anything else that day. When he left at the usual hour, he stopped at the doorway and looked back once at the block of ice on the floor, and at the woman sitting beside it, and at the harvest log in its case beside the entry door, and at the personal saw mounted on the partition wall, and he said, "Saturday," the way he always said it, and he walked back up the lane to his truck. The block sat in the cold room through the rest of the winter. The double walls held. The temperature inside the cold room stayed below freezing through every cold snap of the season, and the block of ice did not melt. Hattie checked it every morning when she rose from her cot. She checked it again every evening before she slept. The block sat on the floor like a small clear witness, and the meltwater that came off it in the brief warm afternoons of late February ran slowly down the drainage channels and out through the drain, and the building did the work it had been built to do, the way a thing built well does the work it has been built to do, regardless of how long it has been asked to wait. Aunt Tilda died in the 3rd week of March 2025. She died in her sleep at the assisted living facility in Rhinelander on a Sunday night, 2 days after Hattie's last visit. The staff called Hattie at the ice house on the small flip phone she had bought after the cellular service had been restored. Hattie drove the 7 miles to Rhinelander in the dark in a borrowed car and arrived at the facility at 1 in the morning. She sat with her aunt's body for an hour. She had been the only family Tilda had left. She made the arrangements herself. She buried Tilda beside her sister June in the small cemetery at the edge of Eagle River, 3 plots away from the grave of Otis Quinn, and 4 plots away from the grave of Greta Quinn. The 4 graves were arranged in a small, loose square. Hattie stood at the foot of the square in the cold March light, with the snow still patchy on the ground, and understood that the 4 people who had raised her and shaped her were now all in this earth. The funeral was small. Hester Anderson came in a black coat with a white handkerchief she did not use. Wilbur Holloway came in his charcoal wool coat and stood at the back of the small group beside the open grave, with his hands folded in front of him. Soren Holloway came with him. Harlan Webb came in his flannel shirt under a dark suit jacket and shook Hattie's hand at the end of the service without saying anything, because saying anything would have undone the careful work both of them had done all morning. Inga Vance had driven up from Eau Claire that morning, and she stood beside Hattie at the graveside and put her arm around Hattie's shoulders during the final reading. And Hattie did not weep, but she leaned slightly into the older woman's coat. The minister read a short passage. Tilda had not been a church-going woman, but she had been a librarian, and the minister had been her colleague on the library board for 15 years, and he had chosen the passage himself. It was from a small book of Wisconsin natural history essays Tilda had recommended to him in 2008, and he read it slowly. And when he finished, he closed the book and stood in silence for a long moment, and then he stepped back from the graveside. Hattie threw the first handful of dirt. She threw it the way her aunt had taught her to do small ceremonial things, slowly with attention, without hurry. The dirt fell on the coffin lid and made a soft sound that the cold March air seemed to absorb without echo. The others followed. She drove back to the ice house in the late afternoon. There was an envelope on her workbench. The envelope had been left there by the assisted living facility in the box of personal effects they had given her the day before. She had not yet gone through the box. The envelope was on top. The envelope had her name on the front in her aunt's handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook the same size as the harvest log her grandfather had hidden in the wall, but newer. The cover was dark green leather. The pages were lined. She opened the notebook. The first page had a date in her aunt's careful librarian's handwriting. April 4th, 1972. The first entry began. My father told me a story tonight about the winter of 1953. The ice on Butternut Lake reached 26 inches in early February, and the cooperative cut blocks for 2 weeks straight. My father said the lake was the strongest he had ever seen it. He said he came home on the night of February 8th, and Greta told him I would be born by morning. He said he did not sleep. He said he sat in the kitchen and listened to the wind and thought about the strong ice. Hattie turned the pages. There were entries from every year of her aunt's adult life. April 1972 to January 2024. 52 years of stories Tilda had heard from her father and had written down slowly 1 or 2 a month in the long, careful evenings of a librarian's life. Stories of harvests, stories of winters, stories of crews, stories of customers, stories of the men who had worked alongside Otis and the men who had worked alongside his father Halvor II, stories of Greta's wedding, stories of June's childhood, stories of the day Hattie was born, stories of the day. Otis came home in March of 1961 and sat at the kitchen table and could not speak. And Tilda had been 8 years old and had not understood until much later why her father could not speak that night. Tilda had written every story down. There was an entry from October 9th, 2008, 5 months after Otis had died. The entry read, "I went into the hall closet today and took down the canvas tool roll. I opened it on the kitchen table. Hattie was at school. I was alone. I unrolled the canvas and looked at the 7 tools my father had used for 60 years. I picked each one up. I held it. I set it back down. I didn't know why I was doing it. I think I wanted to feel his hands on the things he had touched. I think I was trying to understand who he had been when he was working. I do not know if I understood him better afterward, but I understood that the tools were not finished. I understood that the tools needed to keep being used. I do not know who will use them. I am not the right person. I am a woman who reads books. But I will keep them, and I will keep them in working condition, and I will give them to Hattie when she is old enough, and I will tell her they are not decorative." Hattie read that entry 3 times. There was an entry from February 15th, 2024, about 6 weeks after the conversation at the kitchen table. Hattie has moved out of the house. The realtor has shown the house to 4 parties. 2 have made offers. I have accepted the second offer because the buyers are a young family with 2 small children, and the house needs the sound of children. I leave for Rhinelander next Tuesday. I've been thinking for the past month about my father's ice house on Butternut Lake. I drove past the lane this morning. The lane is unplowed. The ice house is still there. I could see the metal roof through the trees. My father told me once that the wall of an ice house is the safest place a man can keep what he loves. I have wondered for 53 years what he meant by that. I think I am beginning to understand. I am going to write Hattie a letter and put it in this notebook, and I am going to leave the notebook for her to find. I am not going to tell her about the ice house directly. I do not want to push her toward anything. If she finds her way to it, she will find her way to it. If she does not, she will find her way to something else. Either is all right. I trust her hands. The entry ended there. Hattie sat at her workbench in the small partitioned room with the green leather notebook open in front of her under the gas lamp. And she read for a long time. And she understood that her aunt had spent 52 years preserving the voice of the man who had taught both of them how to read the world. The aunt who had taken her in without hesitation. The aunt who had read the handbook aloud on winter evenings. The aunt who had given her the canvas tool roll on her 18th birthday, with the instruction that the tools were not decorative. Tilda had been preparing her all those years for the wall. September came again. Hattie was 25 years old. The Northwoods Ice Heritage Project had hired her in her second year at the ice house as a part-time educator and site interpreter. Wilbur Holloway's granddaughter, Madeline, had run the project since 2019 out of a small office in Eagle River. And Madeline had asked Hattie if she would lead winter educational programs for school groups at the ice house, and Hattie had agreed. She had taught third graders and fifth graders and seventh graders how to read the color of lake ice. She had let them hold her grandfather's smaller tools. She had walked them down the loading ramp to the frozen lake in January and February and shown them with the same slow, patient voice her grandfather had used with her that clear blue-black was strong and white was weak and gray was rotten and would not hold. There had been a small girl in the third grade class from Eagle River Elementary who had come out on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 2026 with a group of 22 classmates. The girl was 8 years old. She had a winter coat that was too big for her the way coats are too big for small girls in February in Vilas County. And she had walked down the loading ramp at Hattie's side in her small boots. And at the bottom of the ramp she had stopped and looked out at the frozen lake and asked Hattie how the ice talked. Hattie had knelt beside her. She had told her the same story her grandfather had told her 23 years before on this same lake. About the cold going deeper. About the water shrinking under the surface. About the talk being the ice making itself stronger. The girl had listened. The girl had stood very still and listened to the lake. After a moment, the girl had nodded. She had said she could hear it. She had said it sounded like a door opening underwater. She had said she would remember it. Hattie had nodded. She had said, "That is good. You will hear this for the rest of your life. You will know that the ice is talking." The girl had walked back up the ramp with the rest of the class. Hattie had stayed at the bottom of the ramp for a long moment looking out at the lake. She had cut a single ceremonial block of ice each winter on a Tuesday in mid-December, with her grandfather's personal saw in front of the school groups. The block sat in the cold room through the school season. The cold room held it the way the cold room had held 342 blocks on the 8th of March, 1961, on a clear evening in late September of her 25th year. Hattie sat on the loading ramp of the ice house and watched the last copper light fade across Butternut Lake. The lake was still liquid. It would not freeze until the third week of November. The water was turning the deep, cold blue that the Northwoods lakes turn at sunset in September, when the summer is gone, and the birches along the shore are beginning to go gold. A loon called somewhere out on the water. The white pines above the ice house caught the last light on their highest branches. She thought about her grandfather Otis, who had cut ice on this lake for 15 winters and had locked the loading doors on the 8th of March, 1961, and had cried on the walk back to the truck. She thought about her mother June, who had died on a Sunday morning in March when Hattie was 7, and who had never known that her own father's harvest log and silver and bylaws and personal saw had been hidden inside the building and the tree in the floor, 8 miles from the kitchen where she had grown up. She thought about Aunt Tilda, who had taken in a 7-year-old girl without hesitation and had raised her for 14 years in a small white frame house with an ice saw on the wall above the fireplace and had given her the canvas tool roll on her 18th birthday, and had spent 52 years writing stories in a leather notebook in the long, careful evenings of a librarian's life. She thought about the 4 graves at the edge of Eagle River. She thought about the chest her grandfather had sealed in the wall on the night of March 8, 1961, with a brass padlock and a folded letter and a heavy canvas pouch and a leather-bound book, and about the tools he had wrapped in oiled canvas and hidden under a floor plank, and about the personal saw he had wrapped and hidden in the hollow of a white pine tree at the edge of the cooperative parcel, against the possibility that someone would come. She had come. She thought about what her grandfather had taught her on the morning he had taken her out onto the lake when she was 4. He had taught her to read the difference between what holds and what does not. He had been teaching her for the rest of her life how to notice. The light went down over the lake. The loon called once more far out, and then was quiet. Hattie Quinn was 21 years old and thrown out with $10 to her name on a Tuesday evening in January in the kitchen of her aunt's small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River. She had spent the $10 on a crumbling commercial ice house on the shore of a spring-fed lake in the pine country of northern Wisconsin. It was the best $10 she ever spent.